Philip II of Macedon. Chapter 1. The country that made him. The road north from Thessaly into Macedonia ran through country that the Greeks, even the well-travelled ones, described with a kind of aristocratic distaste. Rough upland valleys, thin soil, timber forests that went on for days. It was a landscape that produced men who were harder than the men of the south, but whom the men of the south did not, for a very long time, take seriously. The Macedonians spoke a dialect that Athenians found barely intelligible. They drank their wine unmixed, without water, which to a Greek was evidence of something close to barbarism. Their kings hunted on horseback, and ate with their soldiers, and maintained a court that the polished men of Athens regarded the way a senator regards a county commissioner, with the specific condescension of those who have decided, without quite examining the question, that they are dealing with their inferiors. They were wrong. They would spend 30 years learning how wrong they were. Some of them would not survive the education. To understand Philip, you must first understand the country that made him. The country was not Greece, and that fact mattered more than almost anything else about him. Macedonia, in the early 4th century BC, was a kingdom in the geographical sense, and barely a kingdom in any other. It occupied the broad plain at the head of the Thermaic Gulf, and extended westward and northward into a chaos of upland valleys. Each valley had its own dialect, its own minor nobility, its own grievances, its own habit of paying lip service to the king at Pella, while doing more or less whatever it wanted in practice. The lowland and the highland Macedonians barely thought of themselves as the same people. The highland clans had their own royal houses, their own ancient claims, their own armies. The clans were the Lyncestians, the Elymeotans, the Orestians. An army is a loose term for any aggregation of armed and angry men with a chieftain at its head. They feuded with each other, they intermarried with each other, they occasionally murdered each other, and in moments of external pressure they remembered they were Macedonians and rallied to the king, after which they remembered they were not really Macedonians at all, and went back to feuding. This was the country. It had no real cities in the Greek sense. Pella was a capital because the king happened to live there, not because it was a polis with assemblies and courts and a long civic life that a Greek would have recognized. The economy was timber, livestock, horses, and the long flat barley fields of the plain. There was wealth in it. The horses alone were already famous. The Thessalian and Macedonian plains produced the best cavalry mounts in the eastern Mediterranean, and the timber was strategic because Athens needed it for the navy and Macedonia had it. But the wealth was not organized. It sat in the country and in the noble houses and in the king's treasury when the king was strong, and out of it when he was not. The kingdom, as a political instrument for converting that wealth into power, was, by any standard the Greeks would have accepted, primitive. Above all, the Macedonian state did not have what every Greek polis had, which was the sense that political life was something every adult male citizen participated in as a matter of definition. Macedonia had a king. The king had nobles. The nobles had men. The men had the king's war when the king called them. Outside of war, they had their own lives, their own land, their own quarrels. The king was someone they thought about when he sent for them, and not really otherwise. The Greeks looked at this and saw a country that had failed to develop. They were not entirely wrong. They were also missing the thing that mattered. A country built this way, when it was finally given a king who knew what to do with it, could move faster and hit harder than any polis ever would. The dialect was the first thing a Greek noticed. A Macedonian speaking his own language to another Macedonian was speaking something an Athenian could pick out maybe one word in 3 of, and an Athenian who claimed to understand it was usually lying or showing off. The educated Macedonians, the king, the court, the men who had been sent south for their education, spoke perfectly good Attic Greek the prestige dialect of the era. They spoke it well enough that no one mistook them for foreigners. But the language of the country, the language of the men in the ranks, the language a king had to use when he addressed his own infantry on the morning of a battle, was not Greek as the Greeks understood Greek. It was something close. It was not the same. The Greek response to this was the response of every imperial culture confronted with a periphery that has its own language. The Macedonians were barbarians. They spoke a barbarian tongue. Their kings might be Greek by descent. The Aegaean house claimed descent from Heracles, and the claim was old enough and well established enough that the Olympic judges had eventually let Macedonian kings compete in the games. But the people themselves were something else. Demosthenes, when he wanted to wound, would call Philip a barbarian to his face. He meant it. He believed it. Most of his audience believed it too. The wine was the second thing. Greeks drank wine cut with water. 3 parts water to 1 part wine in polite company, sometimes more. The mixing was a civic ritual. The symposium proceeded according to careful protocols. The symposiar set the strength of the cup. Conversation moved with the wine. The entire structure of the evening was an exercise in controlled and sociable inebriation, calibrated to produce talk and friendship, and on occasion philosophy. To drink wine unmixed was, in the Greek imagination, what Scythians did, what Thracians did, what the wild men of the steppe did. It was the marker of a man who could not control himself. The Macedonians drank their wine straight. They drank it in volumes that horrified Greek visitors to the court. They drank it at dinner, at councils, at funerals, at weddings, in the field, before battle. They drank it as the Greeks drank water. The Greek visitors who left accounts of Macedonian symposia almost always wrote with a tone of slightly scandalized fascination. The tone of a man who has been to a frontier town and seen what the people there consider normal, and is now back home telling his neighbors about it. The third thing was the kingship itself. Greek political consciousness in the 4th century BC was profoundly anti-monarchical. The cities had killed their kings centuries earlier, most of them in the 7th century, the rest in the 6th, and the experiment in tyranny that had marked the late archaic period had failed badly enough that tyrannos had become a word that no Greek politician wanted attached to him under any circumstances. The Greek world, as it understood itself, was a world of free men governing themselves through assembly and law. Kings were what Persians had. Kings were what barbarians had. A king who walked among his people unguarded, who hunted with his nobles, who married into half the noble houses of his kingdom and absorbed their feuds into his own bloodline. This was archaic. This was Homeric. This belonged to the world of Agamemnon and Priam, not to the world of Pericles and Cleon. But there was a Macedonian counter-argument that no Greek of that generation was prepared to hear. The argument was that a country at the edge of a hostile and chaotic geography could not afford the deliberative leisure of the Greek polis. Illyria sat to the west, Paeonia to the north, Thrace to the east, all of them populated by peoples for whom raiding Macedonia was a recognized form of seasonal economic activity. A polis under attack convened an assembly, debated, voted, mustered its hoplites, marched. A Macedonia under attack needed to be already moving. It needed a man who could decide. The kingship was not an archaic survival in Macedonia. It was the form the country had developed because the country was not Greece, and the conditions of survival were not Greek. A good Macedonian king was therefore a specific kind of man. He had to be a warrior because his nobles were warriors, and they would not follow a man they did not respect on a battlefield. He had to be a hunter, because the great hunts were the school where young noblemen learned to handle horses and weapons and each other. He had to be a drinker, because the symposium in Macedonia was where political business actually got done, and a king who could not hold his wine could not hold his court. He had to be a marrier, because every marriage was an alliance and every alliance was a piece of the kingdom held together. He had to be all of these things, and a tactician, and a strategist, and a diplomat, and a judge, and the head of a household with sons who would, sooner or later, want what he had. The kings who could do all of this lived. The kings who could not did not, and the country went on without them. Philip was born in this country in 382 BC, the third son of King Amyntas III and Queen Eurydice. The dates are uncertain in places, the genealogies are contested, the sources are reconstructions of reconstructions, but the basic outline is clear enough. Amyntas was a king who had been driven out of his own kingdom twice and had clawed his way back twice. Once with the help of the Thessalians, and once with the help of Sparta. He held the throne through a combination of resilience, alliances, and the absence of any rival capable of finishing him. He was not a great king, he was a survivor. The kingdom he passed on to his sons was held together by the fact that he had refused to let it fall apart, not by any deeper reform of the structures that had allowed it to nearly fall apart in the first place. Eurydice, the queen, was an Illyrian. This is one of the small facts about Philip that everyone reads past, and it is worth slowing down on. The mother of the man who would build the army that broke the Greek world was from a people the Greeks regarded as more or less unintelligible savages, and from a kingdom that had been at intermittent war with Macedonia for as long as anyone could remember. She was, by all accounts, a formidable woman. Some of the ancient sources accuse her of having plotted to murder her husband. Other sources defend her as the queen who held the dynasty together through a generation of catastrophe. The truth is probably that she was, like most powerful women in dynastic monarchies, a player in her own right. And the players who survive in dynastic monarchies tend to develop a certain reputation among the men who write their histories afterward. What matters for Philip is that he grew up in a household that was already half Illyrian, in a kingdom that defined itself partly against the Illyrians, with a mother who would have spoken to him in the Illyrian tongue when he was small, and who would have understood, as no full-blooded Macedonian could have understood, the specific psychology of the Macedonian frontier. Philip's later success in handling the Illyrians, in marrying their princesses and absorbing their cavalry, and ultimately destroying their ability to threaten Macedonia, started in the household where he was raised. He had been studying them since before he could walk. He had two older brothers. The oldest was Alexander II in the dynastic numbering, who would be king before Philip was old enough to understand what kingship cost. The second was Perdiccas III, who would be king after Alexander. Both of them would be dead before Philip turned 24. The kingdom would consume them both by violence in front of him, and the violence would not be foreign violence. It would be Macedonian. It would come from inside the household. Philip did not grow up expecting to be king. He grew up in the shadow of brothers who were ahead of him in the line of succession and who showed every sign of having full lives ahead of them. He grew up watching the court. He grew up around the noble houses, the Highland chieftains who came down to Pella for counsel and went home muttering. He grew up in the company of a mother who knew the language of his future enemies and who could explain to him, in the kind of conversation that mothers have with younger sons who are not going to inherit, how the world looked from outside Macedonia. He grew up watching his father, twice exiled, twice restored, managing a kingdom that should have failed, and that had, somehow, not failed yet. This was the apprenticeship. It was an apprenticeship in a country that the Greeks did not respect, conducted by a king who was not great, observed by a boy who was not expected to inherit. None of the obvious indicators suggested that the third son of Amyntas would ever be anyone the Greek world needed to learn the name of. The obvious indicators are usually wrong about men like this. The men like this are the ones the obvious indicators are not built to see. In 370 BC, Amyntas III died in his bed. He was old by the standards of Macedonian kings, which is to say he had not been killed, which by itself made him an outlier. He left the kingdom to his eldest son, Alexander II, and he left behind a country that was nominally at peace and substantively not. The Illyrians were watching. The Thessalians were watching. The southern Greeks were watching. Every neighbor Macedonia had was watching, because the death of a king was the moment a kingdom showed whether it could transfer power without falling apart, and Macedonia's history of transferring power did not inspire confidence. Alexander II reigned for 2 years. 2 years. He was assassinated in 368 BC by a man named Ptolemy of Alaros, who was either Alexander's brother-in-law or his stepfather, or both, depending on which source you trust. Ptolemy took power as regent for the younger brothers. The murder was personal and political at once. These things were always both in Macedonia. It was the first of the murders Philip witnessed at close range. He was 14 years old. He saw his brother killed. He saw the man who killed his brother take over the kingdom. He saw his mother accused of being complicit in the killing, accused by some, defended by others, the truth of it never quite settled. He saw, in other words, the actual mechanics of how a Macedonian succession unspooled when the old order failed. It was not abstract, it was the morning room of his own household, and the people in it were the people he had known all his life. This was the world that produced Philip, not the polished symposium of Athens, not the deliberative assembly of Thebes. It was a court where the queen might or might not have helped to murder the king's eldest son, where the regent who had done the killing now held power, where the surviving brothers were potential threats and potential targets, where every adult male in the room was calculating all the time about who would end up on top when the next round of killing started. Philip watched. He was good at watching. He had been good at it since he was small, and he was about to get better at it, because the next thing that happened to him was that he was sent away. He was sent to Thebes. He was sent as a hostage. He would be there for 3 years. What he learned in Thebes would change everything. Chapter 2: The Inheritance of Disasters. There is a way of telling Philip's story in which the trouble starts when he becomes king. It is the convenient way. It allows the biographer to present the forefront catastrophe of 359 BC as a sudden test, a crucible, a thing that happened to a young man who had been waiting in the wings and was now thrust forward. It is wrong. By the time Philip became king of Macedonia, he had already spent 10 years watching the kingdom try to destroy itself, and the men who had been doing the destroying were, with 1 or 2 exceptions, members of his own family. To understand the man who took the throne in 359, you have to understand what had been happening in the room he grew up in. You have to walk through it slowly, because the speed of it matters less than the texture. The specific way one killing led to another. The way each new murderer became, briefly, the most powerful man in the kingdom. And then, almost as briefly, became a corpse himself. Philip was 14 when his oldest brother was murdered. He was 16 when he was sent away as a hostage. He was 20 when he came home. He was 23 when his other brother was killed in battle, and the throne fell to him by default. In the 9 years between his father's natural death and his own accession, Macedonia killed 2 of its kings and lost most of its army. Philip was either present or close enough to be told the details by men who had been. This is the apprenticeship that the standard accounts skip past. It is also more or less the only education in statecraft Philip ever had. By the time he was old enough to make decisions of his own, he had already seen, at close range, every mistake a Macedonian king could make. The list was long, and most of the men on it were dead. Amyntas III died in 370 BC. He died in his bed of old age. That fact alone, that a Macedonian king had died in bed of old age at the end of a long reign, was enough to confuse the neighboring states briefly about what to expect next. The neighboring states were not confused for long. The eldest son was Alexander, called Alexander II to distinguish him from the cousin and the son who would come later and overshadow him in the records. He was probably in his early 20s when he came to power. The sources are thin on his personality and thinner still on what he was actually trying to do. But the broad outline is recoverable. He inherited a kingdom that had been held together by his father's exhaustion-resistant survival. He tried to do something more ambitious with it. He marched into Thessaly. Thessaly was the broad horse country to the south of Macedonia, and it was politically a mess. The two great families of Larissa, the Aegae, were locked in a struggle with the tyrants of Pherai. The tyrants of Pherai had been trying for 2 generations to consolidate Thessaly into a single state under their rule. The Aegae appealed to Alexander II for help. He went. He brought his army. He took several cities, including Larissa itself. He installed Macedonian garrisons in them. This was an aggressive move, and it had 3 immediate consequences. The first was that the tyrants of Pherai appealed to Thebes for help, specifically a man named Alexander of Pherai, who was, in his own modest way, one of the more interesting brutes of 4th century Greek politics. The second was that Thebes responded. The Theban general Pelopidas, the second-ranking soldier of his city after Epaminondas himself, came north with the Theban army and arbitrated the dispute. He arbitrated it firmly. Alexander II of Macedon withdrew his garrisons, made formal peace, and gave hostages to Thebes as a guarantee of his good behavior. Among the hostages was the youngest brother. Among the hostages was Philip. That is the third consequence. It is the one this story is going to come back to. The boy sent to Thebes in 368 was the boy who came back as a man in 365. The man he came back as had been altered by what he saw there, and what he came back to was the wreckage of everything he had left behind. The wreckage started before he even arrived in Thebes. In 368 BC, while Philip was on the road south, Alexander II was murdered. The killer was a man named Ptolemy of Aleros. The exact relationship between Ptolemy and the royal house is one of those questions the ancient sources answer differently, depending on who is telling the story. Some say he was Alexander's brother-in-law, married to one of Amyntas III's daughters. Some say he was Eurydice's lover, and that she had taken up with him after Amyntas's death. Some say he was both, which is the version that has the most internal logic, and that the surviving Macedonian gossip seems to have preferred. What is certain is that Ptolemy was inside the household. He was close to the queen. He was close enough to the king to get next to him, and one day he killed him. The accounts of the killing are not detailed. There was a festival, or a dance, or some ceremonial occasion at which the king's guard was relaxed and the family was together. Somewhere in the course of it, Alexander II of Macedon was struck down. He had reigned less than 2 years. He left behind 2 younger brothers, both still boys. He also left behind a queen mother whose role in the killing was either partial or total or non-existent, depending on which source you read. She was almost certainly not innocent in some sense, because in the Macedonian court, no one who survived a regicide was innocent. But her specific complicity in the act of murder was never proven and never cleanly disproven. The middle brother, Perdiccas, was now the heir. He was probably 15 or 16 years old. The youngest, Philip, was 14, and at that moment somewhere on the road to Thebes, traveling under guard, not yet aware that he no longer had an older brother. Ptolemy of Aegae took power as regent. He did not take the title of king. He held the kingdom in trust, ostensibly for Perdiccas, who was too young to rule. The question of whether he intended to ever hand it over was, in the manner of these questions, never explicitly answered. The question was answered before it had to be. There is a moment here worth pausing on, because the figure who walks onto the stage at this moment will not be back, but his footprint matters. The man who answered the question of Ptolemy's ambitions was a Theban. His name was Pelopidas, the same Pelopidas who had marched north to settle the Thessalian War, and who had, in the process, picked up the Macedonian princes as hostages. Pelopidas came back to Macedonia in 367 BC on his second northern campaign. What he found this time was a kingdom held by a regent of dubious legitimacy, and an exiled prince making a play for the throne with foreign backing. The exiled prince was a member of the royal house named Pausanias, not the same Pausanias who would matter later. Pelopidas resolved the situation in the manner of a Theban general at the height of Theban power. He came in with an army, brushed Pausanias aside, confirmed Ptolemy as regent on terms that were favorable to Thebes, and took 50 Macedonian noblemen south as hostages to ensure compliance. He took Philip's older brother Perdiccas, the nominal heir, with him as well. The sources are a little contradictory on the timing. Some have Perdiccas in Thebes in 367, some have him still in Macedonia. What is clear is that the Macedonian royal house, as of the late 360s, had members of 3 generations either in foreign captivity or under foreign supervision. The man who had arranged this state of affairs was Pelopidas of Thebes. Philip, in Thebes during these years, was watching this happen. He was watching the city he was a hostage in dictate the politics of the country he was from. He was learning, in the most practical way a young man can learn, what a powerful state looked like when it operated at the level of strategy rather than the level of skirmish. When its generals could move armies hundreds of miles north, install regents, take hostages and go home, and the affected kingdom had no choice but to accept the terms. He was also watching something else. He was watching the way Ptolemy of Alaros held the throne for less than 3 years before being killed in turn. The man who had killed his brother, who was now confirmed as regent of his kingdom, who was sleeping with his mother, dead. The killer this time was Perdiccas, the middle brother, Philip's other older brother, the boy who had been the heir the whole time Ptolemy had been pretending to hold the kingdom in trust for him. Perdiccas had grown up. He was now 17 or 18, old enough to be considered a man in the Macedonian sense. He had reached the conclusion that the man who had killed his brother and bedded his mother was not going to hand him a kingdom voluntarily. So Perdiccas killed him. The mechanics, again, are not preserved with any clarity. There was an opportunity. Perdiccas took it. Ptolemy of Alaros was dead, the regency was over, and Perdiccas was king. Philip was in Thebes when this happened. He would have been 17, maybe 18, depending on which dating you accept. The news would have reached him through the Theban court. It would have been discussed with the bloodless analytical detachment of a foreign court watching a friendly kingdom finally settle its succession crisis. Macedonia had a king. The king was a young man with a clear claim. The regicide by regent had been answered. Order had returned, more or less, to the country to the north. This was Philip's family. This was the house he had been born into. Perdiccas III ruled Macedonia from 365 to 359 BC, 6 years. By Macedonian standards, this counts as a substantial reign. The sources on Perdiccas are even thinner than the sources on Alexander II, but the fragments suggest he was an interesting young man. He was philosophically inclined. He hosted thinkers at his court, including a Platonist named Euphraeus. Euphraeus tried with mixed success to interest the Macedonian nobility in the idea that the king should be advised by men trained in dialectic rather than men trained in killing. The Macedonian nobility found this suggestion ridiculous. Perdiccas was not strong enough or politically established enough to override their disdain, but the experiment is worth noting because it suggests something about the man. A king who thought there might be a better way to do things, who wanted to import some of the intellectual sophistication of the southern Greeks into the rough governance of his own country. He recalled Philip from Thebes around 365 BC. The hostage period was over. Philip came home a young man of 19 or 20, more educated than any Macedonian noble of his generation, fluent in everything that Theban military and political culture had to teach. He was now standing at his brother's elbow as the youngest of two surviving Aegaeid princes. Perdiccas gave him territory to govern. The exact assignment is uncertain. Some sources put him in charge of a district, some have him as a junior commander in the army. But the essence of it was that Philip was being trained for a supporting role in his brother's reign. The way younger brothers in royal households are trained, when their existence is useful but their inheritance is not expected. What was Perdiccas trying to do? On the evidence, he was trying to be a normal king of a country that did not get to have normal kings. He was managing the borders. He was holding the Highland clans in some kind of working alliance. He was trying to build an army that could actually fight, although the army he had inherited was thin and the resources to make it thicker were limited. He was attempting, if the philosophical experiment with Euphraeus is taken seriously, to introduce some Greek polish into the Macedonian court. He was, in short, governing. He was also being watched from the west by an old man with an army. Bardilis was the king of the Dardanians, the largest of the Illyrian tribes. By the late 360s BC, he was somewhere past 70 years old, and had been waging war against Macedonia for most of his adult life. He had broken Macedonian armies before, he had taken Macedonian territory before, he had backed pretenders to the Macedonian throne before. He was not a king who paid much attention to peace treaties. The peace treaties were always made when he was winning, and he had no interest in the formal preservation of arrangements that benefited his neighbors and limited him. In 360 or 359 BC, the dating is contested, Perdiccas decided to settle the Illyrian problem. He would march west, he would meet Bardilis in open battle. He would defeat him, recover the lost territory, and end the cycle of raids and tribute that had been bleeding the Macedonian western frontier for a generation. This was a reasonable plan in the abstract. In execution, it was a disaster. The battle, the location of which is not securely identified, was a catastrophe. The Macedonian army was broken. 4,000 men were killed. Perdiccas III was killed with them. He was 25 years old. 4,000 dead is a number that requires some context to understand. The Macedonian army of the late 360s was probably 10 to 12,000 men, if you counted the highland levies and the lowland infantry and the cavalry of the noble houses. 4,000 was something like a third of the total fighting force. It was the army's veterans. It was the cavalry that the great houses had supplied. It was the men who had been trained, such as the training was, to stand in the line and hold. They were dead, their horses were dead. Their armor was lying on a field somewhere west of the Macedonian heartland, being stripped by Illyrian skirmishers. The kingdom was gutted in an afternoon, and the Illyrians were not finished. Bardilis did not retreat to celebrate. He pressed forward. He occupied Macedonian territory. He showed every sign of intending to convert this victory into the permanent dismemberment of Macedonia as a state. That had been his life's project, and it had never been so close to accomplishment. The news reached Pella in pieces. The first reports would have been the survivors, the men who had run, the cavalry who had escaped, the wounded who had been carried out by their friends. The reports would have been confused at first, and then, as the picture coalesced, catastrophic. The king was dead, the army was broken, the Illyrians were coming. Perdiccas III left a son, an infant named Amyntas IV, who was the legitimate heir under any normal reading of Macedonian succession law. He was a baby. He could not lead an army. He could not address the assembly. He could not, in a kingdom under invasion, be the king the kingdom needed. Macedonia in late 359 BC needed a man who could ride to the western frontier within days and either fight or buy off the Illyrians. An infant was not that man. The Macedonian assembly was the gathering of the army and the nobles and the heads of the great houses. In Macedonia it served the function that the popular assembly served in a Greek polis. The assembly did what Macedonian assemblies did when faced with a succession crisis they could not afford. They made the practical choice. They acclaimed Philip, the dead king's surviving brother, as king or as regent for the infant Amintas. The sources differ on which title he was given. The distinction did not matter for very long. Within 2 or 3 years, Philip was simply king. The question of regency had quietly disappeared. Amintas IV was being raised as a member of the royal household, with no claim to the throne his father had briefly held. But that was later. In the autumn of 359 BC, Philip was 23 years old. He had been back from Thebes for 5 years. He had governed a province, served in his brother's army, watched his brother walk west and not come back. The kingdom he was now expected to save had lost its king. It had lost a third of its army. It had lost the cohesion of its great houses. It had lost the working alliance with the Highland clans. It had lost the capacity to hold its western border. And it was now facing an Illyrian king who had been winning against Macedonia for 50 years and who had no intention of stopping. The Athenians, watching from the south, sent an army into Macedonia that autumn under a pretender named Aegae. The Athenian theory was that an invasion at this moment, with a fragmented Macedonian state and a young man of unproven competence on the throne, would put their preferred candidate in Pella and give Athens a client kingdom on its northern border. They were right that the moment was opportune. They were wrong about almost everything else, but it would take some time for them to realize this. The Thracians, watching from the east, made similar arrangements. They had a candidate of their own, a man named Pausanias, and they were prepared to put their army behind him. The Paeonians, watching from the north, did not bother with candidates. They were a raiding people. They saw a wounded kingdom, and they began raiding it. Villages were burned. Livestock was taken. The northern border, which had been quiet under Perdiccas, was now porous and bleeding. This was the position. 4 enemies, no army, an infant nephew with a claim that was technically better than the regent's, a treasury that the war had drained, a noble class that was watching to see whether the new man could hold the country together, or whether the time had come to start hedging their bets toward whichever pretender looked most likely to win. Philip had been preparing for this moment for 10 years, although he had not known he was preparing. He had been preparing every time he watched a regent get murdered, every time he watched a king march out and not come home, every time he sat in Paminus' household in Thebes and listened to Theban officers discuss what made an army actually work. He had been gathering the materials of a man who would know what to do when no one was left to tell him what to do. He turned out to know. Chapter 3. Thebes. The road from Pella to Thebes was somewhere around 300 miles, depending on which route you took. It was not a road a 14-year-old prince would have traveled in any condition resembling comfort. Hostages were not prisoners in the formal sense. They were not chained, not starved, not abused, but they were not honored guests either. They were political collateral, and they traveled like collateral. Philip would have been escorted by a small Theban detachment, treated correctly, fed adequately, given a place to sleep at the end of each day's march. And he would have been reminded constantly, by every subtle and unsubtle marker that travel arrangements can communicate, that he was being moved at the convenience of a state that was not his own. He arrived in Thebes in 368 BC and was placed in the household of a man named Paminus. The placement mattered. Hostages in the Greek world were sometimes warehoused in some institutional facility, a temple complex, a state-owned residence, a barracks, and sometimes they were placed in private households, depending on the rank of the hostage and the politics of the receiving city. Philip was a king's son, an Argead prince, a member of a royal house old enough that the Olympic judges had stopped contesting its Greekness. He was placed in the home of a senior Theban general. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice on the part of the Theban government to place the boy in a setting where he would be exposed to Theban military culture at the highest level, where he would absorb Theban methods of thinking about war and politics, where, if Theban policy continued to develop in the direction it had been developing, he would eventually go home as something close to a Theban-trained agent of Theban interests in Macedonia. The plan, in other words, was to indoctrinate him. The plan was reasonable. The plan, as it turned out, was also catastrophic. The boy they were indoctrinating was the boy who would, 20 years later, end Theban supremacy in a single afternoon at Chaeronea. They had no way of knowing this. He had no way of knowing it either. He was 14 years old. He was being given access to one of the most sophisticated military cultures in the ancient world, at the precise moment that culture was at the height of its powers, and he was paying attention. To understand what Philip saw in Thebes, you have to understand what Thebes had just done. 3 years before Philip arrived, in the summer of 371 BC, a Theban army under the joint command of Epaminondas and Pelopidas had met a Spartan army at a place called Leuctra in Boeotia and had broken it. That sentence is easy to write and easy to read past, and it deserves to be slowed down on. The breaking of the Spartans at Leuctra was not just a military event. It was the end of an era. It was the moment that the central organizing assumption of 2 centuries of Greek geopolitics dissolved. In an afternoon, on a field most of the people who lived through it could not have located on a map. For 200 years, the Spartan phalanx had been the supreme military fact of Greek civilization that ran from the late 7th century BC, when the Second Messenian War had given Sparta its definitive territorial form, through the entire 5th century, the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, and the early decades of the 4th. Every Greek state built its foreign policy in reference to it. Alliances were made and unmade based on whether they brought a city into Sparta's orbit or kept it out. Cities that defied Sparta did so with the awareness that they might, at any moment, see a Spartan army on their borders. The awareness was usually enough to make them stop defying. The Spartans were not numerous. The full Spartan citizen body, the Spartiates, the men of full citizenship who actually fought in the phalanx, was probably never more than 10,000 at its peak. By the early 4th century it had declined to something like 1,500. They were not numerous. They were just better. They were better because they had institutionalized the practice of war in a way no other Greek city had. The Spartan boy was taken from his mother at 7 and put into the Aegae, the training system, where he lived in barracks with his age mates. He ate the disgusting black soup that everyone wrote about and no one ate voluntarily. He learned to fight. He learned to obey. He learned to endure cold and hunger and pain. He emerged at 20 as a soldier whose entire life up to that point had been preparation for the moment when he would stand in the line. He stayed in the line until he was 60. He was a soldier in a way no Athenian or Theban or Corinthian was a soldier. He was a soldier the way other Greeks were farmers, by occupation, by daily habit, by the structure of his existence. When the Spartan phalanx came over a ridge and the other Greeks saw it coming, the other Greeks were frequently afraid. The fear was rational. The fear was based on accumulated evidence. The fear was, by the early 4th century, baked into Greek strategic thinking at such a deep level that men who had spent their entire adult lives preparing to fight Spartans sometimes simply ran when the moment came to fight them. The cultural certainty that Spartans won was stronger than the immediate evidence of any particular battle. Epaminondas broke this in an afternoon. The conventional Greek battle, as fought for 2 centuries before Leuctra, had a shape so consistent that it had effectively become a ritual. 2 phalanxes faced each other on a flat piece of ground. Each phalanx was 8 ranks deep, sometimes 12, organized so that the strongest unit held the right wing. That unit usually included the contingent that included the commanding general. The reason the right was the place of honor was technical. Each hoplite carried a shield on his left arm, which meant his right side was exposed, which meant a hoplite naturally drifted to the right during a battle, seeking the cover of his neighbor's shield. As both lines drifted right during their advance, the right wing of each army tended to outflank the left wing of the opposing army. Battles were therefore typically decided on the right. The strongest unit on each side broke the weaker unit opposite it, and then turned inward to roll up the rest of the line. Spartan armies followed this pattern. Spartan kings led from the right wing. The famous red-cloaked Spartiates of the Hippias, the king's 300 picked men, fought on the right of the right. The whole structure of a Spartan army on a battlefield was an architecture of tradition and assumption, refined over generations until it had the inevitability of a natural law. What Epaminondas did at Leuctra was refuse to follow the architecture. He stacked his left wing 50 ranks deep, not 8, not 12, 50. He put his best troops there, including the Sacred Band. The Sacred Band was the 300 elite Theban infantry organized in pairs, the most lethal infantry unit in Greece, who had been training for exactly this moment for years. He weighted his left so heavily that the entire center of gravity of his army was on the wrong side of the field by every conventional measure. And he held back his right. This is the part that requires the most attention to understand, because it is the part the conventional accounts often skip. Epaminondas refused his right wing. He kept it back, marching at an angle, deliberately not engaging. He drove his weighted left forward at full speed. The maneuver was called the oblique order, and it was not entirely his invention. There were precedents, fragments of similar tactics in earlier Greek warfare, but no one before Epaminondas had committed to it on this scale. He was betting everything on the assumption that his deep left would crash through the Spartan right before the rest of the battle could develop. Once the Spartan right collapsed, once the Spartiates were dead or fled, once the king was down, the rest of the Spartan line would have nothing to fight for. He was right. The deep Theban column hit the Spartan right at speed. The Spartans on the right wing held, briefly, in the manner Spartans held. They were the best soldiers in the Greek world, and they did not break easily. But 50 ranks of Theban infantry coming at them in a coordinated mass was not the sort of pressure their tactical doctrine had been built to resist. The center of mass, the sheer kinetic weight, was wrong. The Spartans were used to fighting 8-rank armies. Fighting 50 was different in a way their experience had not prepared them for. They held for a few minutes, then they broke. Cleombrotus, the Spartan king, was killed in the breaking. 400 Spartiates died on the field in a few minutes of close combat. These were full citizens of Sparta, the irreplaceable core of Spartan military power. Men whose individual deaths were strategic events because the citizen body was too small to absorb them. 400. By the standards of any other Greek city, 400 dead in a single battle would have been a serious loss. By Spartan standards, 400 dead Spartiates was a catastrophe from which Sparta as a great power would never fully recover. When the Spartan right collapsed, the rest of the Spartan line turned and went home. They had been waiting for an engagement that hadn't yet come from Epaminondas's refused right. The battle, in any meaningful sense, was over within an hour of the first contact. Sparta lost her hegemony in a single afternoon. The city she had dominated for 2 centuries began, in the months that followed, recalibrating. the Peloponnesian League fragmented. Messenia was liberated by Epaminondas in a campaign the next year. Sparta had held it since the 7th century. It was the Helot territory that had supplied the agricultural labor that made the Spartan citizen-soldier system possible. It was gone. Sparta was reduced, almost overnight, from the central organizing force of Greek power politics to a regional city-state of declining demographic and military weight. She would never recover. She would still be there. She would still be Sparta, but the thing she had been, the thing that had cast a shadow across the entire Greek world for 10 generations, was gone. It was gone because Epaminondas had stacked one wing of his army deeper than anyone had thought to stack a wing before. Philip arrived in Thebes 3 years after Leuctra, in the autumn of 368. The atmosphere of the city he walked into is worth pausing on. The atmosphere mattered as much as the technical details of what had happened. Thebes in the late 360s was a city that had just done something everyone had thought was impossible, including, in the deepest part of its own civic consciousness, itself. There is a specific psychology that takes hold in a place that has just upended the structure of its world. The psychology of Thebes in those years was the psychology of a city that no longer believed in inevitabilities. The Spartans had been an inevitability. They had been broken. Therefore, there were no inevitabilities. Therefore, everything was open. Therefore, the conventions and the assumptions and the calcified habits of 2 centuries could be re-examined, questioned, replaced with something better. This is an intoxicating air to be in if you are 14 years old and intelligent and watching it from inside a senior officer's household. Paminus himself was the first piece of Philip's education in Thebes. Paminus was an officer of Epaminondas' circle, a senior commander with a long career behind him. He had a practical understanding of how the new Theban methods actually worked at the level of regimental command. He was not a theoretician. He was the man who took the theory and made it function on a battlefield, who drilled the troops, who managed the supply, who understood, in the hands-on way that only a working officer understands, what could and could not be asked of an army on a given day. Living in Paminus' household meant living among other officers. Listening to their conversation, hearing the after-action discussions of campaigns that had just ended, and the planning conversations of campaigns about to begin. It meant absorbing, in the natural osmotic way a young man absorbs the culture of the household he is embedded in, the operating language of a successful military culture at the height of its powers. But Paminus was the first piece. The second piece was Epaminondas himself. The exact nature of Philip's contact with Epaminondas is one of those points the ancient sources hint at without quite documenting. Some accounts have Philip living in Epaminondas' household directly, others in Paminus', others a sequence, first one, then the other. What is consistently reported is that Philip was in the orbit of Epaminondas, that the two of them had conversations the Theban tradition remembered, and that the boy from Macedonia was treated by the great Theban general with a degree of intellectual seriousness unusual for a foreign hostage. Epaminondas was a remarkable man. He was a Pythagorean. He was a member of the philosophical religious community founded by Pythagoras in the previous century, by his time more of an intellectual disposition than an organized sect. He had a Pythagorean's habit of seeking the underlying mathematical structure of problems. He was poor by the standards of Theban aristocracy. He lived simply, ate plainly, and wore the same cloak winter and summer. The story went that it was the only one he owned. He was incorruptible. He was profoundly intelligent. He spoke in the public assembly with the kind of restrained authority that comes from having nothing to lose and nothing to prove. And he had, more than anyone else of his generation, the temperament that allowed him to question the inherited assumptions of Greek military practice and to design alternatives from first principles. This was the man who, for 3 years, was within reach of a 14-year-old, then 15-year-old, then 16-year-old Macedonian prince. The conversations between them are not preserved. We have no record of what Epaminondas said and Philip heard. But we know what came out of those years on Philip's side. The army Philip eventually built was an army that solved the problems Epaminondas had identified, the problems Epaminondas had partially answered, the problems Epaminondas had pushed open and not quite closed. The continuity of thought is too consistent to be accidental. What Philip got from Epaminondas was a way of seeing. The boy in Pamenes's household was being given it without quite understanding yet that he was being given it. The way of seeing was this: military methods are not natural law. They are conventions. They are the accumulated decisions of generations of men, most of those decisions reasonable in their own time, some of them thoughtful, many of them inherited without examination. The 8-rank phalanx was a convention. The strong right-wing doctrine was a convention. The hoplite himself, with his round shield and his medium-length spear and his expectation of a single decisive battle on a flat piece of ground, was a convention. None of these things had to be the way they were. Each of them was a choice that could, with sufficient analytical clarity and sufficient courage, be replaced with a different choice. Most men cannot think this way. Most men, when they have grown up inside a convention, cannot see the convention from outside. They mistake it for nature. They mistake the way things are done for the way things must be done. The first thing Epaminondas had to do, before he could fight Leuctra, was stop seeing the 8-rank phalanx as the only possible phalanx. The second thing was design something better. The third thing was actually do it. He had to do it in front of an enemy whose entire military culture was organized around the assumption that no one would do it. Philip watched this. Philip absorbed it. Philip understood, and the understanding was the seed of everything he would later become. That what Epaminondas had done at Leuctra was not a stunt. It was a method. The method was generalizable. If the conventions of Greek warfare could be analyzed and replaced once, they could be analyzed and replaced again and again. The man who could do this on a sustained basis, who could keep finding the place where the inherited assumption failed and the new design succeeded, would have, over time, an advantage so cumulative that no traditional army would be able to stand against him. This was what Philip went home with. This, more than any specific tactic, more than the oblique order or the deep wing or the use of cavalry as the hammer to the infantry's anvil. The method, the habit of mind, the willingness to look at the way things were done and ask, why? And then to ask the harder question, the question most men never ask. And what if it could be done another way? The sacred band was the third element. Philip would have seen them in Thebes during those years, in the way a hostage sees a city's most famous regiment, at parades, at festivals, at the formal reviews that any military culture conducts to display its premier units to itself and its visitors. They were 300 men. They lived together at state expense in a barracks on the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes. They trained together every day. They were paired. Every man in the unit was bonded with another man in a relationship the Greeks would have understood as both military and mentor. Plato would argue it was a philosophical bonding, while others would say it was the Aristes and Eromenos. Whatever it was, Thebes had taken it further than anyone else by building an entire elite regiment around it. The theoretical basis for the sacred band was the idea, articulated by various Greek thinkers, and most cleanly by Plato in the Symposium, that a man would not break in front of the man was grouped with. He would not run. He would not shame himself. He would die before he humiliated himself in the eyes of the one person whose opinion of him mattered most. An army of pairs, the theory ran, would therefore be an army that did not break. The theory had been tested for nearly 4 decades by the time Philip saw the band, and the theory had held. The sacred band had fought in every major Theban engagement of those 40 years. They had not broken. Other Theban units had broken. The sacred band had not. They were, by the late 360s, the most lethal infantry unit in Greece. They had earned the reputation through a long series of battles in which they had simply stood when other units around them had not. Philip, watching them, would have absorbed something the Theban officers around him probably did not fully realize they were teaching. The sacred band was not just a unit, it was a proof of concept. It was a demonstration that the right organizational principle, applied with sufficient discipline, could produce a fighting force that was qualitatively superior to anything its opponents could field. The principle in this case was the mentor-brother pairing. But the deeper principle, the transferable principle, was that institutional design mattered. A unit's effectiveness was not just a function of the individual courage of its men. It was also a function of the structure that bound them to each other. If you could find the right structure and apply it consistently, you could engineer a result that no amount of conventional courage could produce. When Philip went home and built the companion cavalry, he was reproducing the principle. He took the Macedonian high nobility and bound them to him through the formal institution of heteroi, through shared meals and shared hunts, and the wedge formation they trained in until it was reflex. Not the specific institution. He was a Macedonian, building a Macedonian cavalry corps, and the Theban model would not have transposed directly. But the principle did transpose. The companion cavalry, by the time he was finished with it, was a unit bound to its king and to itself by a structure of obligation and shared identity that made it qualitatively different from the noble levies that had preceded it. It was a unit that did not break. It was a unit that hit harder in concentrated charges than any cavalry the Greek world had ever fielded. It was the sacred band's principle applied to horses in a country that had horses in a way Thebes had never dreamed of. He was learning. The whole time he was in Thebes, he was learning. There were also things he was learning that the Theban officers were not deliberately teaching him. He was learning, by simple proximity, what a serious state looked like from inside. Macedonia in his lifetime had been a kingdom that staggered from one crisis to another. Its court was structured around personal loyalties and personal feuds. Its army was assembled from levies that arrived when called and went home when the campaign was over. Thebes was something different. Thebes had institutions. The Theban army was a standing institution with permanent officers, permanent training schedules, permanent supply arrangements. The Theban political system, however imperfect by Athenian democratic standards, had a continuity to it that did not depend on the survival of any particular man. Generals could die. The army went on. Officers could fall in battle. The next officer in the chain stepped into the role and the unit kept fighting. This was, for a Macedonian, a profound observation. Macedonia had not had institutions of this kind. Macedonia had had men. When the men died, the kingdom convulsed. The notion that a state could be designed to survive the death of its individual operators was not a notion that came naturally to a Macedonian prince. You could build something more durable than a single household, more transferable than a personal loyalty network, more resilient than a great king's reputation. It was something he was being shown by example every day he spent in Thebes. He was also learning, in the negative case, what Theban politics were not. Thebes was a successful state in 368, but Thebes was not a state that would convert its military success into long-term hegemony. Even at 14, even at 16, Philip could see the cracks. The Theban political class was divided on questions of foreign policy that they could not resolve. They were brilliant at war and mediocre at the politics that turned won wars into stable orders. They had defeated Sparta, but they could not figure out what to do with the victory. The cities of Boeotia, theoretically united under Theban leadership, were perpetually nervous about Theban ambitions. The cities of the Peloponnese, freed from Spartan overlordship by Theban arms, were grateful in the short term and increasingly suspicious in the longer term. Thebes was a great power that did not quite know how to be a great power. The limits of its statecraft would, within a generation, give the hegemony back to the next contender. Philip, watching, would have noticed. The man he became was a man who had learned, partly in Thebes, what the failure to do these things looked like. He paired military victories with political settlements. He married the women of the kingdoms he beat. He built the League of Corinth instead of just garrisoning Greece. He understood that a victory not converted into a stable order was a victory that would have to be fought again. He had seen, in the months of his hostage years, a state that won battles brilliantly and lost the longer game. He would not lose the longer game. He had been studying the people who did. He came home in 365 BC. He was probably 17, possibly 18, depending on which dating you accept. He had been gone 3 years. He had arrived a 14-year-old prince of a country in convulsions. He was leaving an educated young man whose intellectual formation had taken place in the most sophisticated military culture in the Greek world. He had been in the orbit of the man who had broken Sparta, in a city electric with the consciousness of having made the impossible possible. He came home to a country that had spent those 3 years in the same convulsions he had left it in. His brother Perdiccas had killed Ptolemy of Alaros in the year before, or in the same year, the timing again uncertain. The kingdom had a king now, his second brother, the philosophically inclined young man who was trying to import Greek learning into the Macedonian court. Philip stepped back into a household that was full of survivors and absences. His oldest brother was dead. His mother was older. The court had reshuffled in ways that took some weeks to fully understand. The provinces were what they had always been. The Illyrians were still on the western frontier. The Athenians were still making policy in the south. But Philip was different now. He was not the boy who had been sent away. He was a young man with a mind that had been refurnished with new tools and new categories and new ways of seeing. He had, although he could not yet have known it explicitly, a complete answer to the question of how a small kingdom with a precarious political structure and a contested frontier could become, with sufficient time and sufficient ruthlessness, the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. He had the answer in pieces. He had the principles. What he had not yet had a chance to do was put it into practice. He was given a chance to start. Perdiccas put him in a position of regional command. The exact title and territory are not securely preserved, but the substance was that he was given some piece of the kingdom to administer, with some piece of the Macedonian army to administer it with. Philip used the years from 365 to 360 to begin testing what he had learned, not at the scale of national strategy. He was a junior brother, not a king, but at the scale of a regional command, with a few thousand men under him, on a frontier that was always in some kind of trouble. He drilled, he experimented. He began in a small way to do what he would later do at a much larger one. Take the inherited methods of Macedonian arms, hold them up against the standard he had absorbed in Thebes, ask what could be improved, and improve it. He was not yet building the army that would conquer Greece. He was building the practice that would let him build that army when his moment came. His moment came in 359, when Perdiccas marched west and did not come back. Chapter 4. The Year of 3 Kings. The first thing Philip did when he became king was give a speech. The sources do not preserve the words, but they preserve the fact of it, and the fact is the more important thing. He addressed the army assembly in Pella. The army assembly in 359 BC was not a parade ground formation but a battered remnant. It was the men who had survived the Western disaster mixed with the men who had not been called up for it, and the noble houses staring at each other across the courtyard with the particular intensity of men who were trying to decide which way to bet. He addressed them. He told them, in whatever specific language the moment called for, that Macedonia was not finished. He told them that the Illyrians could be beaten. He told them that the army would be rebuilt, the borders would be held, the kingdom would survive. He told them this in a voice that the men listening came away believing. This was the first thing. It was, in retrospect, the most important thing. Macedonia in the autumn of 359 was a kingdom one bad week from disintegration. The difference between disintegration and survival was, in the first instance, whether the men in the courtyard at Pella believed that the man speaking to them knew what he was doing. They believed it. Some of them were lying to themselves about why they believed it. They wanted to believe it. The alternative was hiding their families and burying their valuables and waiting for whichever foreign army arrived first. But the lie they chose to tell themselves was the lie that gave Philip a working week, then a working month, then a working year, then 23 years. He had the gift. He had it from the beginning. The men who watched him speak in that first week came away convinced. And the conviction was not entirely a matter of charisma in the obvious sense. It was something more specific. It was the way he had absorbed information in those first hours after the news from the West arrived, the way he had asked the right questions, the way he had held the table while the bad news kept coming, the way he had made decisions about which messengers to send first, which men to summon, which orders to give before sleeping, all of it with the unhurried clarity of someone who had been thinking through this kind of problem for 10 years. He had been thinking through this kind of problem for 10 years. That was the truth of it. The 14-year-old who had watched his oldest brother get killed, the 17-year-old who had watched his middle brother kill the killer, the 20-year-old who had come home from Thebes and started drilling provincial troops in techniques no one in Macedonia had seen before. All of those previous versions of himself had been, without his fully knowing it, preparing the man who walked into the assembly in 359 already knowing what to do. He gave the speech. The army went home that night believing, more than they had believed when they arrived, that Macedonia was going to survive. And then Philip went back to his quarters and started writing letters. The first letter was to the Paeonians. The Paeonians were the simplest problem, and therefore the first to be addressed. They were a tribal confederation north of Macedonia, ruled by a king named Aegae. What they wanted from Macedonia was straightforward. They wanted livestock and slaves and movable wealth. They took it in raids, and the raids would continue for as long as Macedonia was too weak to stop them. They were not interested in conquering Macedonia. They had no candidate for the throne. They had no strategic vision for the Macedonian future. They were a raiding people, and they were taking what was available. Philip's letter offered them money. The amount is not preserved, but the substance is clear. He offered Aegae a substantial sum to call off the raids and to formally recognize Macedonia's borders. The money came out of the treasury that had been drained by Perdiccas's war. Philip had to scrape it together from sources that included, on the evidence, his own personal household and the contributions of nobles who could be persuaded that the alternative to writing a check now was being raided by the Paeonians next month. He scraped it together. He sent it. Aegae took the money. The raid stopped. This is the kind of decision that the heroic traditions of military biography tend to skip past, because it does not feel like leadership in the way that winning a battle feels like leadership. It is, in fact, the harder decision. A young king with a freshly assembled army and an injured pride has every cultural and emotional reason to march out and fight the Paeonians, to demonstrate his masculinity through arms, to show his nobles that he is not a man who pays tribute. Philip did the opposite. He paid the tribute. He did it because he had calculated accurately that the Paeonians were the cheapest of his four problems to solve. Solving them cheaply freed up resources for the more expensive problems. The appearance of weakness implied by paying off a tribal confederation was a price worth paying for the operational reality of having one fewer enemy on the board. This is what they meant in Thebes when they said institutional thinking. This is the difference between a king who wins battles and a king who wins kingdoms. Philip understood the difference at 23. Most men who become kings never learn it. The second letter was to Athens. Athens had sent an army into Macedonia under the pretender Aegae. The army was not large by Athenian standards, perhaps 3,000 men under a general named Mantius. Its mission was to install Aegae in Pella as a client king. The Athenians had a long-standing grievance about the city of Amphipolis on the Strymon River. It had once been an Athenian colony, and it had been independent for several decades, and Macedonian kings had been alternately threatening and protecting it, depending on their immediate political needs. The Athenians wanted Amphipolis back. They wanted a Macedonian king who would either give it back or stand aside while they took it. Philip wrote them a letter. The letter offered them, in substance, exactly what they wanted. He withdrew the Macedonian garrison from Amphipolis. He renounced any Macedonian claim to the city. He invited the Athenians to do as they pleased with it. In exchange, he wanted the Athenian army withdrawn and the support for Aegae dropped. The Athenians considered the offer. The offer was, on its face, generous to the point of suspicion. A young king who was willing to give up Amphipolis without a fight was either a king so weak that he could not hold it, or a king so calculating that he was buying himself time at the cost of a piece of territory he intended, eventually, to take back. The Athenians chose to read it as the first interpretation. They were wrong. They would have many years to discover how wrong. The Athenian army withdrew. Aegae was abandoned by his sponsors. He tried, with a small force of mercenaries and Athenian volunteers who had not gotten the word that the campaign was over, to march on Pella anyway. Philip's troops met him in a small engagement near Methone and destroyed the force completely. Aegae was captured. Philip released him. The mercenaries who had fought for him were released on parole. The Athenian volunteers were sent home with a letter to the assembly thanking the city for its understanding and emphasizing Philip's continued goodwill. This was masterful. The Athenians had backed a pretender. The pretender had been beaten. The captured pretender had been released. The captured mercenaries had been released. The captured Athenian volunteers had been released. And Philip had been the one being magnanimous, the one demonstrating restraint, the one writing diplomatic letters to a city whose army had just invaded his country. The Athenians were left looking like the aggressors who had been forgiven by their own victim. The diplomatic position Philip had bought himself by this maneuver was worth a great deal more than the technical sovereignty over Amphipolis he had renounced. 2 years later, when the political situation had shifted, Philip retook Amphipolis and kept it. The Athenians protested. Philip pointed out accurately that the original treaty had specified Athenian rights to the city but had not specified that Macedonia could never take it. The Athenians did not have an answer to this because they had been outmaneuvered. They had been outmaneuvered in 359 by a young man whose offer had been precisely calibrated to be too good to refuse and not legally binding in any way that mattered. But that was 2 years later. In 359 itself, the Amphipolis offer was the maneuver that bought Philip his early survival, and the later betrayal of it was, by the standards of the politics he was operating in, the kind of betrayal that everyone expected and no one held him fully accountable for. The third problem was Thrace. The Thracian king Cotys had sponsored the pretender Pausanias. Pausanias was somewhere in the eastern part of the kingdom, with a small Thracian force, claiming the throne. Philip dealt with this through a combination of bribes and intimidation. He paid Cotys' senior advisors to recommend that Cotys disengage from a venture that was unlikely to pay off. He demonstrated, through small but visible military movements on the eastern frontier, that any Thracian reinforcement of Pausanias would meet a Macedonian response Cotys was not prepared to handle. He offered Cotys, through back channels, the possibility of a more constructive future relationship. Macedonian goodwill might prove more valuable than the dubious investment in a pretender of uncertain prospects. Cotys took the bait. The Thracian support evaporated. Pausanias, abandoned by his sponsor, was hunted down by Macedonian troops and killed. The body was displayed publicly. The point was made. 3 of the 4 problems had now been solved. The Paeonians had been bought off. The Athenians had been outmaneuvered diplomatically, and their pretender killed in a brief skirmish. The Thracians had been suborned, and their pretender killed. The treasury was emptier than when Philip had inherited it. The army had been used in 2 small engagements and reinforced by the addition of mercenaries that the gold from various sources had purchased. The kingdom, which had 4 enemies in September of 359, had 1 enemy by the spring of 358. The remaining enemy was Bardylus. Bardylus was the hardest problem. Bardylus was the problem that had killed Perdiccas and 4,000 men. Bardylus had to be fought, because Bardylus could not be bought. And he could not be bought because he was already in possession of Macedonian territory and saw no reason to give it back. The Illyrian War was the war Philip had been deferring, while he cleared the rest of the board. Now the rest of the board was clear, and the Illyrian War was waiting. He had spent the winter preparing for it. The army that marched west in the spring of 358 was not the army that had been broken at the disaster of the previous year. It was a different army. It was, in its early form, the army that would later destroy Persia. Philip had spent the winter doing things to the Macedonian forces that no Macedonian king had ever done. He had taken the men who had survived Perdiccas' war and combined them with the men who had not been called up. He had drilled them through the winter, in conditions of cold and hunger and physical exhaustion, until the survivors of the drilling were a different kind of soldier from what they had been when the drilling started. The drilling continued from dawn until dusk. The men slept in the field. They marched in formation under load, for hours at a time. They learned to wheel, to advance, to halt, to reverse, on simple verbal commands repeated until the formations could execute the maneuvers in their sleep. He had also, during that winter, introduced the Sarissa. The mechanics of the new weapon will be the subject of the next section, because the Sarissa deserves more space than the Bardylus campaign has room for. What matters here is that the men who marched west in the spring of 358 were carrying weapons their fathers had not carried, in formations their fathers had not used, drilled to a standard their fathers had not been drilled to. It was a different army, in a real and immediate sense, even though it had been built in 6 months. The difference was already enough to surprise anyone who was paying attention. Bardylus was not paying attention in the right way. He had broken Perdiccas. He had 50 years of victories behind him. He saw a young king of a wounded kingdom marching out with a hastily assembled army to repeat his brother's mistake. He prepared for the battle that he had won so many times before that he could recite the stages from memory. He prepared in the conventional Illyrian way, a strong infantry square, the warriors arrayed in deep formation, the famous Illyrian capacity for absorbing punishment and pressing the broken enemy through the gap. He was old. Some of the Illyrian sources put him at over 90, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but it tells you something about the legend. By the time he met Philip, Bardylus was a figure of mythical longevity in the eyes of his own people. He was somewhere between 70 and 80. He had been winning his entire adult life. He had no reason to think he would not win this time. The battle was fought somewhere in the Western Highlands. The exact location is not preserved. The contemporary maps are not detailed enough to fix it, but the basic shape of it can be reconstructed from the fragments. Philip's force was approximately 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. Bardyllis had something close to 10,000 infantry of his own. The numbers were close to even. The Illyrians formed up in their hollow square. Philip's infantry advanced. What happened next was the first demonstration, on a real battlefield, of the system Philip had been building. The Sarissa armed phalanx engaged the Illyrian square frontally. They were the new infantry, with their long pikes and their drilled discipline. They did not break the square. They were not yet good enough to break it, but they fixed it. They held it in place. They engaged it in a way that absorbed the Illyrian attention and committed the Illyrian formation to a fixed position on the field. Then the Macedonian cavalry struck. The cavalry charge against an Illyrian flank was executed in wedge formation under Philip's personal command. Philip rode with the cavalry that day and on every subsequent day of his career. This was the second half of the system. The phalanx fixed, the cavalry killed. The combination did to Bardyllis what it would later do to the sacred band at Chaeronea, what it would later do to the Persians at Issus, what it would later do at every battle Philip and Alexander would fight from this day forward. The Illyrian square broke. The breakage propagated. Within an hour the field was a rout, and the Macedonian cavalry was running down fleeing Illyrian warriors across miles of broken country. 7,000 Illyrians were killed. The number is not entirely reliable. Ancient battle counts rarely are, but the order of magnitude is. Most of an Illyrian army died on that hillside, and most of them were killed in the pursuit. The pursuit was the part of a battle that the Macedonian cavalry under Philip would always make their specialty. The dead were stripped. The wounded were finished. Bardyllis himself was killed. Some accounts have him cut down in the rout. Some have him surrendering and being executed afterward. The truth is probably closer to the first version. The old king who had fought Macedonia for 50 years did not survive his last battle. The Illyrian territory that had been taken was returned to Macedonia. Additional Illyrian territory was annexed beyond what had been lost. The western frontier was pushed further out than it had been in living memory. A daughter of one of Bardyllis' surviving family, the Princess Odata, was sent to Pella to marry Philip. The marriage formed the basis of a treaty that locked the surviving Illyrian leadership into a relationship of formal subordination that would hold for the rest of Philip's life. Philip was 24 years old. He had been king for less than a year. He had cleared the board of every enemy that had been in position to destroy his kingdom on the day he took the throne. He had built, in 6 months, the prototype of an army that the ancient world had not seen before. He had married a woman whose people had killed his brother. He had buried a king who had been winning battles when his father was still a child. This was the beginning. Chapter 5. The Sarissa. The Sarissa was a pike, but the word pike does not carry the weight it should. A spear, in the Greek world, was a weapon a man could use with one hand. The hoplite carried his dory in his right hand, while his left arm carried the aspis, the round shield that protected him and his neighbour in the line. The dory was a spear about 8 feet long. It had a leaf-shaped iron head at one end, and a bronze butt spike at the other. It was a balanced weapon. It was light enough to throw, stiff enough to thrust, short enough to recover. A man trained in the use of it could fight with it for hours in the constricted space of the phalanx without exhausting his arm or losing his control of the weapon. It had been the standard infantry weapon of the Greek world for 3 centuries. The entire architecture of Greek infantry warfare had been built around its specifications. The 8-rank formation, the shield wall, the close order combat that concentrated the maximum number of dory points in the minimum frontal area. The Sarissa was something else. The Sarissa was between 15 and 21 feet long. The exact length is debated among modern scholars, the ancient sources giving different numbers depending on the period. Philip's original Sarissa was probably 15 to 18 feet. The weapon that Alexander's veterans carried into India was probably longer. The version used by Hellenistic armies a century later was longer still. The shaft was made of cornel wood, a dense hardwood that grew in the mountain forests of Macedonia and Thessaly. It was prized for its combination of stiffness and resilience. The head was an iron point, smaller than a hoplite spearhead, designed for thrusting rather than throwing. The butt was weighted. It was a heavy iron ferrule that served three functions. It balanced the weapon along its length, allowing the soldier to grip it about a third of the way back from the head, rather than at the dead center. It served as a secondary weapon for use when the head was buried in an enemy or broken, and it could be planted in the ground to receive a charge, the weighted base anchoring the shaft, while the head pointed outward at the chest of an oncoming horse or man. The weapon weighed somewhere around 13 pounds. This is heavier than a hoplite spear by a factor of 2 or 3. It was not a weapon a man could hold up casually. To wield it required 2 hands. To wield it for hours, in formation, on a battlefield, required the kind of physical conditioning that ordinary infantry levies did not have. By any individual measure, the Sarissa was a worse weapon than the dory. It could not be thrown. It could not be used effectively in single combat. It could not be wielded with a shield in the way a dory could. The soldier carrying a Sarissa had to hang his shield from a strap around his neck, leaving both hands free for the pike. His shield protection was reduced to whatever the strap allowed. It was awkward. It was heavy. It was, from the perspective of an individual fighter, almost absurd. It was also the most lethal infantry weapon ever introduced to the ancient battlefield. To understand why, you have to stop thinking about individuals. The Sarissa worked because of what happened when you put many of them together. Imagine a phalanx of Sarissa-armed infantry formed up in a block 16 ranks deep and 50 or 100 files wide. The men in the front rank hold their pikes level, head extended, butts braced near the right hip. The men in the second rank hold their pikes at an angle that brings the heads forward, past the shoulders of the front rank, extending the threat zone by another 4 or 5 feet. The third rank does the same, their pike heads extending past the second rank, the fourth rank, the fifth rank. By the time you get past the fifth rank, the angles become too steep for the heads to project effectively forward. The rearward pikes are held vertical or near vertical, ready to step forward as casualties open gaps in the front ranks. What you have, looking at this formation from the perspective of an enemy approaching it, is not a single line of spears. You have 5 overlapping ranks of pike heads, each rank's points extending past the rank in front. The visual effect, the sources tell us, was a moving thicket of iron, interlocking points presented at multiple distances, with no obvious gap through which a man could pass. To approach the formation was to approach a wall that had blades growing out of it at 5 different depths, all of them pointed at the chest of anyone who tried to come close. It was nearly impossible to close with, and what cannot be closed with cannot be fought, because the only weapon a hoplite or an Illyrian warrior or a Persian infantryman had was a weapon for fighting at arm's length. The Sarissa moved the fight outside arm's length. It moved it 16 feet outside arm's length. The traditional infantry weapons of the ancient Mediterranean were useless against it because they could not reach. This was the mathematical core of what Philip had built. 5 iron points where there had been 1, a threat zone 15 feet deep where there had been a threat zone 3 feet deep. The ratio of pike heads to enemy bodies on any given square of frontage had been transformed. The transformation was the kind of transformation that, when it works, does not get fixed with a tactical adjustment. It gets fixed by abandoning the entire prior way of fighting and developing something new. The Persians never figured out how to fight it. The Greeks took 2 centuries to figure out how to fight it. By the time they had, the men using it had become the masters of the world. But the Sarissa as a weapon was only half the achievement. The other half was the men holding it. A Sarissa phalanx requires a specific kind of soldier. He must be physically conditioned to hold a 13-pound pike level for extended periods. He must be mentally conditioned to hold his position in a formation where his individual contribution is invisible, where his pike head is one of hundreds, where his survival depends entirely on the men to his left and right and behind him doing exactly what they have been trained to do. He must be trained to wheel, to halt, to advance, to retreat, in coordinated movements that no individual heroism can substitute for. He must be trained, above all, to do this when men around him are dying. Philip's drilling regime, in the months and years after he took the throne, was unprecedented in Greek military practice. The Macedonian infantry of the old type had been a seasonal levy. They were farmers and herdsmen called up when the king needed them, marched to the war, returned home when the campaign ended. They had been adequate for short border wars and the kind of internal feuding that had occupied the Macedonian state for most of its history. They had not been an army in the sense that the Spartans were an army, or the Sacred Band was a unit. They had been men who carried weapons. Philip changed this. He introduced what was, in effect, a standing infantry corps. The men did not go home at the end of the campaign season. They drilled through the winter. They drilled in formation. They drilled as units that retained their composition over years, the same files of men working together over and over again until the coordination was reflex. The pikes themselves had to be issued and maintained. 15-foot corner shafts were not weapons a peasant brought from home. They were state-issued equipment. They were manufactured under royal contract, distributed and accounted for through what was, by the standards of the 4th century Greek world, a sophisticated quartermaster system. He paid them. This is one of the points the conventional accounts skip past, and it is worth pausing on. The Macedonian infantry under Philip were paid soldiers. Not as well as Greek mercenaries, not consistently in coin, but they received regular allotments of food and supply, and eventually of land. They received, more importantly, the social status of professional soldiers in a state that had never had professional soldiers before. They were not farmers anymore. They were the king's men. They wore his livery. They carried his pikes. They were paid, fed, housed, and trained at his expense. What he received in exchange was a weapon that no other Greek state had, an army that could march in March and still be in the field in October, that could campaign for years on end, that could be deployed at distances that would have been operationally impossible for a seasonal militia. This is one of the silent revolutions of Philip's reign. He did not just invent a new weapon, he invented a new kind of soldier to use it, and he invented a new state apparatus to support the new kind of soldier. The apparatus and the soldier and the weapon together were a system that the rest of the Greek world would not figure out how to match for 2 generations. The pikemen were the anvil, the companion cavalry was the hammer. The Macedonian high nobility had always fought on horseback. The horses were there, the men were there, the riding tradition was there. What had not been there before Philip was the institutional structure that turned a collection of individually competent aristocratic horsemen into a coordinated cavalry force capable of operating as the decisive arm of a combined system. Philip built the structure. He took the noble cavalry and reorganized them into formal units, squadrons of about 200 men each. They served under named officers, with regular drilling schedules and coordinated formations. The premier formation was the wedge. The wedge was a cavalry charge in the shape of a pointed triangle, the lead rider at the apex, the file widening behind him into a steadily expanding mass of horsemen. The point of the wedge concentrated the kinetic energy of the entire formation into the single rider at the apex. He hit the enemy line at the chosen point of attack and drove a hole into it that the riders behind him widened and exploited. This was the sacred band's principle, as I discussed in the previous section, transposed onto cavalry. The sacred band had built a unit whose effectiveness came from the institutional structure, binding men to each other in pairs. The companion cavalry built a unit whose effectiveness came from the institutional structure binding men to their king, to their squadron, to the wedge formation in which they had drilled until it was reflex. The principle was the same, the application was different, and the result, when the wedge struck a fixed enemy formation that had been pinned by the Sarissa phalanx, was the kind of cumulative tactical effect that no enemy in the Eastern Mediterranean would prove able to absorb. The companion cavalry was bound to Philip personally. The senior nobles served in it as a matter of honor. Their sons trained for it from boyhood. The status of being a companion, a heteros, literally a comrade of the king, was the highest social distinction available in Macedonia. It carried with it both privileges and obligations that bound the noble class into the king's service in a way the previous Macedonian kingship had never managed. They ate with him. They hunted with him. They went to war with him. They were, in the formal language of the Macedonian court, his friends. The friendship was a political institution that converted what had been a fragmented and feuding nobility into the strike arm of the most aggressive monarchy in the Greek world. Philip himself rode at their head. This is one of the small facts about his career that, when you assemble enough of them, tells you most of what you need to know about the man. He led from the front. He was not a king who waited at the back of the formation while his nobles charged. He charged with them. He took the wounds. He lost the eye at Methon. He took the wound to the shoulder in Thrace. He took the wound to the leg that left him limping for the rest of his life. The body of Philip II of Macedon, by the time it was killed in 336, was a body that had been shot at, cut, broken and patched together over 20 years of leading from the front. The men who served under him knew it. They had seen him bleed. They had carried him out of skirmishes. They had watched him take wounds that should have killed him and recover and ride out again. The bond between Philip and his companion cavalry was not a bond of formal hierarchy. It was a bond forged by shared danger over 20 years of campaigning. It was the kind of bond that produced a fighting force that did not break when the hard moment came. The Sarissa phalanx fixed. The companion cavalry killed. The combination was the system. But Philip was not finished. The system had two more elements that the conventional accounts often skim past. The elements mattered, because they were what allowed the system to operate at the scale of imperial campaigning. The first was the engineering corps. Philip gathered, at his court at Pella, a group of military engineers. They were Greeks for the most part, men recruited from the eastern cities where the science of siegecraft had been developing for generations. He gave them a mandate to develop the technologies that would let his army take walled cities. The Greeks had been bad at siegecraft for a long time. Greek wars had been mostly hoplite affairs decided in the field. The cities in the Greek world had walls that stood up to the limited siege techniques available, and a long siege was something a Greek state did when it had no choice and got out of as fast as possible. Philip's engineers changed this. They developed torsion catapults, siege engines powered by the compressed sinew or hairsprings of skein bundles. They were capable of throwing projectiles with force and accuracy that previous siege engines had not approached. They developed siege towers, mining techniques, methods of assault that had not previously existed in the Greek world. By the late 350s, Philip had an army that could not only beat anything in the field, but could also, given a few weeks, reduce a walled city. This was a capability the Greek city-states had not had to plan against. No Greek state had previously possessed it. It transformed the strategic calculus of every city that found itself at war with Macedonia. The second was the logistical reform. Philip banned the use of pack animals. This sentence requires explanation. Pack animals were the standard means by which Greek armies moved their supply and equipment. A typical Greek army on campaign was followed by a baggage train of mules, donkeys, oxen, and the human servants who tended to them. The baggage train ate as much as the army did. It moved more slowly than the army did. It made the army dependent on supply routes and supply schedules in a way that constrained where the army could go and how fast it could move. Philip looked at this system, decided it was inadequate to the kind of campaigning he intended to do, and abolished it, more or less by decree. Macedonian soldiers under Philip carried their own equipment. They carried their own food. They carried their own bedding. They carried their pikes, their shields, their armor, their personal kit. The result was an army that could move twice as fast as a conventional Greek army, an army that was not tethered to a slow-moving baggage train, an army that could appear in places its enemies had not expected an army to be capable of appearing in. It was also an army of soldiers whose physical conditioning was qualitatively different from the conditioning of conventional Greek hoplites. Carrying your own equipment for a 30-mile day, day after day, week after week, builds a kind of strength and endurance that occasional drilling does not. The Macedonian infantry of the late 340s could march distances that no Greek army had previously been able to march. The marching capacity, multiplied across years of campaigning, allowed Philip to achieve strategic surprise on a scale that none of his contemporaries quite knew how to defend against. This was the system in its full form. The Sarissa phalanx that fixed enemy formations frontally, the companion cavalry that struck the fixed formation in the flank, the engineering corps that reduced the walled cities the field army marched up to, the logistical reform that allowed the army to move at speed across distances that other armies could not match. Each piece reinforced the others. None was sufficient alone. The combination was a war machine of a kind the ancient world had not previously seen. By 358 BC, it was operational and in the field and looking for somewhere to go. It went first into the Greek north. The next chapter is what happened there. Chapter 6. Eating Greece. The pattern that defined Philip's 12-year consumption of the Greek north was a pattern visible only in retrospect. At the time, year by year, what people in the Greek south saw was a series of opportunistic interventions by a barbarian king who happened to be more competent than expected. They did not see, because they had no framework for seeing it, that the interventions were not opportunistic. They were systematic. They were the visible surface of a strategic project that Philip had been building towards since the moment he took the throne. The project had a specific shape. The shape was the slow, methodical absorption of every territory north of Thermopylae into the Macedonian state. He did this in pieces. He did it patiently. He did it by exploiting, with the precision of a surgeon, every internal weakness, every diplomatic crack, every opportunity that the disordered politics of the 4th century Greek world threw in his path. He did it almost always while presenting himself as a reasonable man responding to circumstances rather than as an aggressor pursuing an imperial program. The presentation was the second weapon after the army. It was what allowed him to take a city in 357 and another in 356 and another in 354 without ever quite triggering the kind of unified Greek response that would have stopped him. The Greeks did not unify against him until 339. By then it was too late. The first piece was Amphipolis. I mentioned earlier that Philip had renounced Amphipolis in 359 as part of his diplomatic settlement with Athens. The renunciation was a tactical maneuver. It bought him the diplomatic space to deal with his other enemies. It was understood by both parties as a gesture rather than a permanent commitment. What Philip understood, and what Athens did not understand or chose not to understand, was that Amphipolis was a city of such strategic importance to Macedonia that no Macedonian king who could take it would in the long run refuse to take it. Amphipolis sat at the mouth of the Strymon River, controlling the eastern approach to Macedonia and dominating the coastal road that ran east into Thrace. More than that, it controlled access to Mount Pangaeus, the silver and gold mountain that lay just inland. The mines of Pangaeus had been worked since the late Archaic period. They had made fortunes for Athens. When Athens had controlled them in the 5th century, they had made fortunes for the independent city of Amphipolis after that. Any state that controlled them would have access to a stream of precious metal that, in the cash-poor economy of 4th century Greece, was equivalent to the discovery of an oil field. Philip took Amphipolis in 357. He did it with a brief siege, the engineers' new catapults reducing the city's resistance faster than its defenders had thought possible. He took the city. He kept it. The Athenians sent diplomatic protests, and Philip responded with the legal argument I described earlier. The original treaty had specified Athenian rights, not Macedonian non-rights. The Athenians, who had no army on the ground and no allies prepared to march, had no answer. The Pangaeus mines began producing for Macedonia. The historical sources put the annual output at around 1,000 talents of silver. That was an astonishing sum, approximately the annual income of Athens at the height of its imperial power, flowing now into Philip's treasury. The treasury that had been empty in 359 was, by 355, full. The army that had been hastily assembled in 359 was, by 355, the best paid and best equipped army in the Greek world. The bribery network I will discuss in the next section was, by 355, fully funded from a permanent stream of revenue that Philip controlled directly and did not have to share with any council or assembly. Amphipolis was the keystone. Once it fell, everything downstream became affordable. The next pieces were Pydena, Potidea, and Methon. Philip took them in sequence between 357 and 354. Pydena was a Greek coastal city on Macedonia's own coast. It had been technically allied with Athens. It was geographically inside the territory Philip considered Macedonian. He took it in 357, almost simultaneously with the operation against Amphipolis. The Athenians lost it. They lost it permanently. There were no diplomatic protests this time. The Athenians were beginning to understand that diplomatic protests were not effective against Philip and were preparing instead for a more substantial response. A response that, characteristically, they would talk about for several years before doing anything about. Potidea was on the Chalcidic Peninsula, the three-fingered landmass that extended south from Macedonia into the Aegean. It was a member of the Athenian-led Second Athenian League. Philip took it in 356. He took it in cooperation with the Olynthian Confederacy, the local league of Greek cities on the Chalcidic Peninsula. They supported the Macedonian campaign in exchange for being given the territory of Potidea after the city fell. This was the kind of deal Philip became expert at, using local political fractures to advance Macedonian objectives, paying off local allies with territorial gains, walking out of each operation with both the strategic objective achieved and a new set of grateful clients ready to support the next operation. The Athenian League lost Potidea. The pattern of Macedonian expansion at Athenian expense had now been established 3 times. Amphipolis, Pydna, Potidea. The Athenian assembly was beginning finally to understand that something systematic was happening, and that the systematic something was bad for Athens. Methon was the last and the longest. It was a Greek city on the Macedonian coast that had been a thorn in Philip's side from the beginning of his reign. It had supported Aegae in 359. It had supported every subsequent attempt to interfere in Macedonian politics. It was small, but it was strategically located. Throughout Philip's first decade, It had played the role of the splinter that he could not quite remove without spending more effort on it than the immediate strategic value justified. By 354, he was tired of it. He laid siege to it. The siege lasted most of a year. During the siege, an arrow fired from the city walls struck Philip in the right eye. The wound did not kill him. The eye was unsalvageable, and the Macedonian doctors who treated him had to leave the empty socket as it was. He lost the eye. The wound, in some accounts, would have killed any other man. There was infection. There was the possibility of brain damage. The surgery was crude. Philip survived it through some combination of luck and physical resilience that became, in the legend that grew around him, one of the small markers of the inhuman quality the Greeks would eventually attribute to him. He took Methone. He razed the city to the ground and dispersed its population. The thoroughness of the destruction was unusual for Philip, who normally preferred to absorb conquered cities rather than destroy them. The historical consensus is that the destruction of Methone was personal. He had lost an eye to that city. The city paid the price. The eye was the first of the visible wounds. It would be followed by others. The broken collarbone in Illyria, the wounded thigh in Thrace, the leg that left him limping. By the time he was 40, he was a man whose body told the story of his career on its own surface. He did not hide the wounds, he wore them. The empty eye socket, the limp, the scarred face, these became, in the propaganda of his court and in the perception of the men who served under him, the markers of a king who had earned his throne in the field and who continued to lead from the front. The wounds were not weakness, they were credentials. The sacred war was the next piece, and it was the piece that brought Philip into the political life of Greece proper. The sacred war was a religious war, in form. The Phocians had committed sacrilege against the temple of Apollo at Delphi. The Amphictyonic Council, the religious league responsible for governing the temple, had declared war against them. The war had been going on, fitfully, since 356. By 353, the Phocians, financed by the temple treasures they had been illegally exploiting, had developed into a serious military power. They were threatening the entire structure of Greek religious authority. Philip intervened. He intervened on the side of the Amphictyonic Council, which is to say on the side of religious orthodoxy, against the Phocians. The intervention was, on its face, a pious act, a defense of the gods against a sacrilegious enemy. In substance, it was the moment Macedonia entered Greek politics as a recognized player rather than a barbarian state on the periphery. The campaign did not go cleanly. Philip's army was actually defeated in 353 by the Phocian general Onomachus in 2 engagements in Thessaly. This is one of the small facts that the conventional accounts skip past, but it is worth slowing down on. Philip lost 2 battles. He lost them to a general who was, briefly, the most successful military commander in the Greek world. The losses might have ended his career, or at least his Greek ambitions, if he had been the kind of king who responded to defeat by retreating into his own kingdom and consolidating his existing gains. He was not that kind of king. He withdrew, regrouped, returned the next year with a larger force, and met Onomachus at the Battle of the Crocus Field in 352. The Battle of the Crocus Field was the largest battle Philip had yet fought. The numbers are not securely preserved, but the order of magnitude was around 20,000 on each side. The Phocians lost. Onomachus was killed. 6,000 Phocian soldiers died in the battle, and 3,000 more were captured. Philip ordered the captured prisoners drowned in the sea. They were executed as sacrilegious thieves who had stolen from the gods. The executions were carried out as a public statement of the religious legitimacy of his cause. The Crocus Field was a turning point. Philip had now established himself as the military arbiter of Greek religious politics. he had defeated the strongest field army in northern Greece. He had also absorbed Thessaly into the Macedonian sphere. He was elected Archon of the Thessalian League, which gave him formal control over the Thessalian cavalry. The Thessalian cavalry was the best heavy horse in the Greek world. It was thereafter integrated into the Macedonian army and fought at his command for the rest of his career. The integration of Thessalian cavalry was one of the great strategic prizes of the Crocus Field. The Macedonian companions had been the best cavalry in Greece. With the Thessalians added, Philip now commanded a cavalry force that was, in size and quality together, beyond anything any Greek state had previously fielded. The Sacred War was not over. The Phocians, with new leadership, fought on for several more years, but the strategic trajectory was now fixed. Philip had become, formally and in fact, a Greek power. He attended Amphictyonic council meetings. He was seated as the representative of the Thessalians at the Pythian Games. By 346, he was voting on the religious affairs of Greece, in the same body that the Athenians and Thebans and Spartans voted in. He had, in other words, infiltrated the institutional life of the Greek world. He was no longer outside it. He was inside it, and he was using the inside position to continue the project he had started outside. The Peace of Philocrates was the next piece. It was negotiated between Philip and Athens in 346, after the final destruction of Phocian resistance. It was the last formal peace agreement Philip and Athens would ever conclude. The peace was, in its terms, a recognition by Athens of every territorial gain Philip had made up to that point. Amphipolis, Padna, Potidaea, Methone, Olynthus. Olynthus had been taken in 348 in another campaign I have not yet described in detail. It was the Macedonian destruction of the Olynthian confederacy that had once been Philip's ally, and was, after the confederacy began drifting toward Athens, his enemy. All of these were now formally Athenian losses. The peace also recognized Philip's position in the Amphictyonic Council, which Athens had previously refused to accept. It recognized, in everything but explicit language, that the strategic situation in northern Greece had been settled, and that the settlement was Philip's. The peace was negotiated by an Athenian embassy that included two figures who would matter for the rest of this story. Demosthenes, who advocated against the peace because he saw it as a capitulation, and Aeschines, who advocated for it because he had been bought by Philip and was operating, by this point, as a Macedonian agent in the Athenian assembly. The negotiations took the better part of a year. The terms, when finally agreed, were the terms Philip had wanted from the beginning. He gave up nothing. He kept everything. The Athenians signed because they had no military option that could change the situation on the ground. The alternative to signing was a continued state of war with Macedonia, and the continued state of war with Macedonia would have meant the immediate Macedonian intervention in central Greece that 6 years later would happen anyway. The Peace of Philocrates bought Philip 6 years. It was time he used to consolidate what he had taken, to extend his reach into Thrace and into the Hellespont, and to prepare for what he had been preparing for since 359. He was preparing for the moment he would no longer need a peace with Athens, because he would have ended Athens as a strategic factor. That moment came at Chaeronea, in the summer of 338. But before Chaeronea, there's Demosthenes. Chapter 7. The Donkey of Gold. Philip is supposed to have said that there was no wall so high that a donkey carrying gold could not enter it. The exact wording varies in the sources, but the substance is consistent. He said it without embarrassment. He meant it as operational principle. The Greek world, for 20 years, was a working laboratory for the truth of the principle. Philip was applying it everywhere, all the time, with a budget that the Pangaeus minds made effectively unlimited. The bribery network was the third leg of Philip's system. After the army and the diplomacy, it was the leg that made the army and the diplomacy work. The army could only solve military problems. The diplomacy could only solve problems that were susceptible to formal negotiation. There were always, in any Greek city, problems that lay between these two. Political problems, factional problems, problems of internal alignment that could not be solved by an army at the gates and could not be solved by a treaty signed at the council. These were the problems Philip solved with money. He solved them so consistently in so many cities over so many years that by the time the Greeks were ready to fight back, they discovered that significant portions of their own political class had already been working for the other side. The mechanics of the bribery were not crude. Philip did not generally walk up to a Greek politician and offer him a sack of gold to betray his city. The mechanics were more subtle than that. They were the mechanics of patronage networks, of long-term relationships, of favors exchanged over years until the recipient of the favors was, by structure rather than by choice, aligned with the interests of his benefactor. It worked like this. Philip's agents would identify in any given city the men who could be useful. The agents were Macedonian diplomats, Greek allies in his service, men who traveled the Greek world on his account. The men who could be useful were not necessarily the best politicians of the city, or the most prominent, or the most powerful. They were the men who had ambitions that the city's existing power structure was not satisfying. They were second-rank politicians who wanted to be first-rank. They were merchants who wanted political influence proportionate to their wealth. They were generals out of favor. They were ambassadors whose careers had stalled. They were men, in other words, with grievances and ambitions and the kind of constrained circumstances that money could meaningfully relieve. To these men, Philip's agents would offer not direct payments but opportunities. Trade concessions, land grants in Macedonian territory, loans on favorable terms, marriage contracts with daughters of Macedonian nobility, appointments to honorable positions at Philip's court, speaking engagements at festivals where Philip's hospitality was lavish. The gifts were not always money in the direct sense. They were the kinds of gifts that, in the patronage culture of 4th century Greek politics, were entirely normal forms of civilized intercourse between cities. A Greek politician could accept them without violating any obvious norm. He could even, with a straight face, describe them as evidence of the appropriate respect being shown to him by a foreign power that recognized his importance. Once accepted, the gifts created relationships. The relationships created obligations. The obligations were called in, slowly at first, then more frequently as the years passed. A small favor returned for a small gift. A speech in the assembly that supported a Macedonian position, a vote against a measure that would have damaged Macedonian interests, a piece of intelligence about what the assembly was likely to decide next month. Each individual act was small. Each could be defended, if questioned, as a matter of independent judgment that happened to align with Macedonian interests for principled reasons. Each was deniable, and each one tied the recipient of the original gift one step further into a network that he had not, when he accepted the original gift, fully understood he was joining. By 346, this network existed in every major Greek city. It was strongest in Athens, weaker in Thebes, present in Argos and Corinth and Megara and the smaller cities of the Peloponnese. It was not a unified instrument under Macedonian control. It was, more accurately, a layer of disposed sympathy across the Greek political class. These were men who, when push came to shove, would find themselves arguing for accommodation with Philip rather than resistance, and who could not always articulate, even to themselves, why they had become advocates of accommodation rather than resistance. This was the donkey. This was the gold. This was the wall that no city could keep him out of, because he had already bought the gatekeepers. The Athenian network was the most fully documented. It was the network that Demosthenes spent 20 years dragging into the public light, and the records of his speeches and prosecutions preserve names that would otherwise have been lost. The most prominent Athenian in Philip's pay was Aeschines. Aeschines was on his own terms a serious figure. He had been an actor in his youth, then a minor official, then a man who had risen through the Athenian political class on the strength of his oratorical skill. He was capable. He was articulate. He was a man whom an Athenian audience would listen to. He was also, by the time of the Peace of Philocrates negotiations in 346, on Philip's payroll. The exact moment of his recruitment is not preserved. The substance of it was this. Aeschines, who had originally been a critic of Philip, became an advocate for accommodation after a diplomatic mission to Pella. On that mission he was lavishly entertained, given gifts and exposed to Philip's personal charm. He returned from Macedonia and gave a speech to the assembly in which he described Philip in glowing terms, recommended the peace, and dismissed the warnings that other Athenians were sounding about Philip's intentions. Whether Aeschines was bought outright or simply seduced was, even at the time, a matter of dispute. Demosthenes argued that Aeschines was bought, but Aeschines argued that he had simply formed his own honest judgment, and that Demosthenes was attacking him for political reasons. The truth is probably somewhere between the two positions. Aeschines almost certainly received money from Macedonian sources. He almost certainly also genuinely believed, in some part of his mind, that accommodation with Philip was the wiser policy. The two things were not separate. They reinforced each other. The money made it easier to believe the policy was wise. The belief that the policy was wise made it easier to accept the money. This is the texture of how the bribery network actually worked. It was not, in most cases, a simple sale of conscience. It was a slow rearrangement of incentives until the men who had been rearranged could no longer cleanly distinguish their own interests from the interests of the man who was paying them. They remained, in their own minds, free Athenian citizens making independent judgments. The judgments, however, had a way of consistently coming out in favor of the man who had been investing in their careers for the better part of a decade. There were others. Philocrates himself, the lead negotiator of the peace and the man whose name the agreement bore, was almost certainly in Philip's pay. He was prosecuted in 343 for treason, fled into exile, and was condemned to death in absentia. Aegae, another senior Athenian politician, was a Macedonian asset for years. The list goes on. Demosthenes, in his speeches over the course of 2 decades, named perhaps 20 Athenian politicians as Macedonian agents. Most of the names he gave were probably accurate, though some of them were certainly political enemies he was tarring with the available brush. The aggregate effect was that the Athenian assembly, throughout the 350s and 340s, was a political body in which a meaningful portion of the senior political class was on Philip's payroll. The policy debates were therefore not the debates between Athenian patriots that the assembly thought they were. They were debates between Athenian patriots on one side and Macedonian agents on the other. The Macedonian agents argued, eloquently, persuasively, often sincerely, for the policies that served their patrons' interests. The Athenian assembly mostly did not know this. The Athenian assembly mostly did not want to know this. To know this would have been to acknowledge that the city was being eaten from the inside. The cognitive work required to maintain the alternative belief that the assembly was a free body of free citizens reaching honest judgments was less painful than the work of acknowledging the truth. This is why Demosthenes was so frustrated. This is what he was screaming about. Year after year, in speech after speech, he was telling his city that it was being bought. His city was not listening. The men he was naming were continuing to give speeches and to be applauded and to win votes. The slow strategic disaster of Philip's expansion continued because the city's political will had been compromised before any military question was asked. Demosthenes was the man who saw it. He was a lawyer by trade, a wealthy man by inheritance, a politician by the choice he had made in his early 30s when he turned from the law to the assembly. He was not a beautiful speaker by the conventions of Athenian rhetoric. The sources record that he had, in his youth, struggled with a stammer or a weak voice. He had cured himself through the famously absurd discipline of declaiming on the seashore with stones in his mouth. The discipline produced a speaker whose oratory was urgent, precise, and morally relentless. He did not flatter his audiences. He told them what they did not want to hear. He told them, year after year, that they were losing their city. The Philippics were the four major speeches he delivered against Philip between 351 and 341. They are masterworks of strategic alarm. The first Philippic in 351 identified Philip as the central threat to Athenian interests and called for immediate military preparation. The assembly listened politely and did nothing. The second Philippic, in 344, after years of further Macedonian expansion, was sharper. The third Philippic, in 341, was the speech of a man who had run out of patience with his own city. He named the assets. He described the network. He laid out, with the analytical clarity of a prosecutor, the specific mechanisms by which Philip was eating the Greek world while the Greeks failed to notice. The Athenians listened. They cheered the speeches. They did not act on them. The reasons are complicated. Athens in this period was a city of about 250,000 people. Its political class had been formed in the long shadow of the Peloponnesian War defeat. Its financial situation was strained. Its military self-confidence was fragile. The kind of action Demosthenes was demanding, a serious mobilization, the dispatch of fleets and armies, the formation of a Greek alliance under Athenian leadership, required commitments and risks that the Athenian assembly was not prepared to authorize. They wanted the threat handled. They did not want to handle it themselves. It is worth being careful here, because Demosthenes is one of those figures whose reputation has been simplified into hero or villain depending on which side of the eventual argument one takes. He was not infallible. He was not always right. There were moments when his analysis of Philip's intentions was probably overheated. Moments when his proposed responses were probably impractical. Moments when his rhetoric was so corrosive of his political opponents that it made the practical work of building an Athenian consensus harder than it might otherwise have been. He was a partisan in a city of partisans. He had his own faction, his own enemies, his own personal grudges. He was, in short, an Athenian politician. But he was also, on the central question, right. He saw what was happening before anyone else in his city saw it. He named it accurately. He proposed the only policy that could have stopped it. And he watched, year after year, as his city refused to adopt the policy because the policy was hard and the cost of doing nothing felt low. The cost of doing nothing was not low. It was paid in 338 at Chaeronea. It was paid by the men of his generation who died on a field they should not have had to fight on, in a battle that should have been fought 20 years earlier when Athens still had the leverage to win it. Demosthenes, when the moment finally came, fought himself. He served in the line at Chaeronea. He was not a soldier, and the men around him were better suited to the work, but he was there, in the formation. When the line broke, he ran with the rest of the broken line. His enemies later mocked him for running. The mockery is worth ignoring. He had stood. The men who had been on Philip's payroll for 20 years had not stood. The line between them was a moral line, even if the line that broke on the field was not. The other side of Philip, the side that made the bribery work, the side that the conventional account of him as a calculating monster does not quite capture, was that he was in person charming. This is one of the consistent features of the sources. Greek diplomats who came to Pella expecting to deal with a barbarian king came back having dealt with a host. They came back having been entertained by a man who knew their cities, their politics, their personal histories. Philip had agents who briefed him on his guests before they arrived, the same way he had agents who paid them after they returned home. They came back having drunk his wine and listened to his stories. They had watched him deliver dinner party performances of philosophical conversation that were better than what most Athenian symposia produced. They came back, in many cases, having been bribed. They came back also having genuinely liked him. This was the difficulty. Philip was not the figure that the anti-Macedonian rhetoric in Athens described. He was not a tyrant in the obvious sense. He did not threaten his guests. He did not brutalize his subjects in front of foreign visitors. He maintained a court that was, by the standards of 4th century kingship, civilized. He brought Aristotle to Macedonia in 343 to tutor his son Alexander. Aristotle was the philosopher who had been a student of Plato's, who had taught at the academy, who was at the time perhaps the most distinguished living thinker in the Greek world. Aristotle stayed at the Macedonian court for several years. Philip and Aristotle were on terms that, while not preserved in detail, are clearly indicated by the fact that the philosopher accepted the appointment in the first place and stayed long enough to substantially shape the education of the future king. This was a king who hosted Aristotle. This was a king who could quote Homer in Greek, that an Athenian could not catch him in error on. This was a king who held symposia where the conversation ranged across history and philosophy and politics, and who held his own in the conversation, and who at the end of the evening had managed to extract from his guests political concessions that they had not realized they were giving. This was a king whose personal manner was so engaging that men who had been raised to despise Macedonians came home admiring him, and who could not always cleanly explain to themselves the path by which they had moved from one position to the other. This was what Demosthenes was up against. The threat was not the obvious threat of a brutal foreign king. The threat was a threat that did not look in person like a threat. The threat smiled. The threat was generous. The threat asked thoughtful questions about your home city's political situation and remembered the answers years later. The threat was, by every external measure, a more attractive interlocutor than most of the politicians of the Greek cities that should have been organizing against him. Demosthenes was, in a sense, asking his fellow Athenians to dislike a man who was personally easy to like, to organize against an enemy who did not feel like an enemy, to commit to an alliance against a king who, when he visited, was a more interesting dinner companion than the men proposing the alliance. It is a hard rhetorical task to ask men to mobilize against charm. It is harder still when the man whose charm you are warning them against has been quietly buying half of them for years. Demosthenes was working at a triple disadvantage. Against the army, against the bribery, against the charm. He held the line, more or less for 20 years. The line broke at Chaeronea. It broke not because Demosthenes had not seen the breakage coming, but because the city he was trying to save had not in the end wanted to save itself. Chapter 8. Chaeronea. The march south happened in the summer of 338. Philip moved the army through Thermopylae on a pretext. The pretext was a renewed religious cause concerning the city of Amphissa. Amphissa had been declared sacrilegious by the Amphictyonic Council, and Philip was now, in his role as a council member, called upon to discipline it. The pretext was thin. Everyone understood it was thin. The mobilization that followed in Greece was not a response to the pretext. It was a response to the obvious fact that Philip's army, once through the pass and into central Greece, was not going to stop at Amphissa. Athens and Thebes finally allied. They allied late. They allied because Demosthenes, in the spring of 338, had finally managed to broker a treaty between the two cities. It had taken him 20 years of effort. The two cities had historically been enemies. They had been cultivated by Philip separately with the explicit purpose of preventing this alliance from forming. Demosthenes had gone personally to Thebes. He had argued in the Theban assembly. He had made the case that Theban interests, despite all the prior history, were now aligned with Athenian interests against the larger Macedonian threat. The Theban assembly for once was persuaded. The alliance was formed. It was the alliance Philip had spent his entire reign trying to prevent, and it was formed too late, because Philip's army was already on the move. The combined Greek force that gathered to meet Philip was substantial, perhaps 35,000 men in total. It included the sacred band on the Theban right, a force of Athenian hoplites on the left, and various smaller contingents from cities that had reluctantly joined the alliance after Athens and Thebes had committed. The numerical odds were roughly even. The armies were closely matched in size. The qualitative difference, the difference that would decide the battle, was that Philip's army had been campaigning together for 20 years. The Greek army had been formed in the last 3 months. They met near a small town called Chaeronea in Boeotia on a stretch of plain along the Cephisus River on a day in early August that the sources record as having been hot. The disposition of the armies tells you most of what you need to know about the battle before any blow was struck. Philip held the right wing with the Macedonian veterans. The center was held by the experienced Macedonian phalanx, the Sarissa formations that had ground their way through 20 years of campaigning. The left wing was given to Alexander, the 18-year-old son. This is the first thing worth pausing on. Philip put his 18-year-old son in command of a wing of the largest battle the Macedonian army had yet fought. The son had been at his father's side on previous campaigns. The son had served as regent of Macedonia at 16, while Philip campaigned in Thrace. The son had won small engagements on his own. But Chaeronea was the major engagement of Philip's career. Chaeronea was the battle that would decide whether Macedonia became the master of Greece, and Philip put the boy in charge of the wing that was directly opposite the sacred band. The placement was deliberate. It was not a sentimental gesture. Philip was telling his army, and telling Alexander, and telling the entire Greek world through the visible disposition of his line, that the boy was ready, that the boy could be trusted, that the boy was, by his father's judgment, the heir not just by blood but by demonstrated competence. The placement was a message. The message was received by everyone who could read it, including Alexander himself. He carried, from that day forward, the specific psychological burden of being the son who had been entrusted at 18 with the wing of his father's greatest battle. The Greek line opposite was disposed in the conventional Greek manner. The Athenians on their left, opposite Philip himself, the Thebans and the sacred band on their right, opposite Alexander, various smaller contingents in the center. The Greek generals had no particular plan beyond holding the line and meeting the Macedonian advance with the traditional weight of the hoplite phalanx. They had not adapted to the Sarissa system because they did not fully understand it. They had not adapted to the Macedonian cavalry because they had no equivalent. They were going to fight the battle they knew how to fight, against an army that had been designed specifically to defeat the battle they knew how to fight. The battle, in its broad outlines, went as Philip had planned it. He executed, on his right wing, a deliberate withdrawal. The maneuver was complex. It required his veterans to march backward in formation, holding their pikes up, retreating without breaking, drawing the Athenian hoplites opposite forward in pursuit. The Athenians took the bait. They had to take the bait. A retreating enemy was the irresistible signal in Greek warfare. It was the moment when the line broke. It was the moment when individual courage could be converted into collective rout. It was the moment when the disciplined hoplite phalanx historically transformed into a pursuing mass that ran down the broken enemy and finished the battle. The Athenians had been raised on this pattern. They saw the Macedonian right falling back, and they pressed forward with all the energy that a generation of Athenian young men, trained on tales of Marathon and Salamis, could bring to the moment when their phalanx finally got to advance against a yielding enemy. The advance pulled the Athenian line out of alignment with the rest of the Greek formation. A gap opened between the Athenian left and the Theban right. The gap was small at first, but it widened as the Athenians pressed forward, and the Thebans, who were engaged frontally with the Macedonian phalanx, could not advance with them. The Greek line was, in effect, splitting in the middle. The Athenian wing was pursuing what it thought was a beaten enemy. The Theban wing was holding its position. The center between them was hollowing out. This was the moment. Alexander struck. The Macedonian cavalry on the left wing, Alexander at their head, had been waiting. They moved at speed into the gap that had opened between the Athenian and Theban wings. They drove through the gap. They struck the Theban line and the flank. They struck the sacred band specifically, the 300 who held the right of the right, the unit that for 40 years had not broken in battle. They struck them in the flank. The flank of any infantry formation, however disciplined, is the position the formation is not designed to defend. The sacred band turned. They tried to reform. They could not reform fast enough. The cavalry pinned them. The phalanx, which had been engaging them frontally, pressed forward as their attention was divided. The sacred band was now being engaged on two sides, front by the Sarissas, flank by the Macedonian heavy horse. They held. They held in the manner Spartans had held at Leuctra and would have held at Marathon, in the manner the sacred band had held at every prior battle. They held until they began, one by one, and then in pairs, and then in larger groups, to die. The sacred band did not surrender. This is the fact that, more than anything else about the battle, has held the memory of Chaeronea in the Greek tradition for 2.5 millennia. They were 300 men. They were paired, every man with the man he loved. They had been told for the entirety of their adult lives that they would not break. The institutional structure of their unit was, at its deepest level, a structure designed to make the surrender of any individual man unthinkable. Surrender meant the abandonment of the man who is beside him. The abandonment of the man who is beside him meant a betrayal so total that no Theban man of their class could conceive of returning home with that betrayal on his record. So they did not surrender. They were offered terms. The sources are clear on this. Philip, through his officers or through Alexander, sent word across the line that the unit could lay down its Sarissas and live. The offer was not impossible. Surrendered prisoners were a normal feature of Greek warfare. Cities ransomed their captured soldiers. Lives were saved. Honor, in the conventional sense, was preserved by the act of having fought before surrendering. The sacred band had fought. They had been outflanked. They had been pinned. They had taken casualties. They had, by any reasonable standard, demonstrated the courage their institutional reputation required of them. They could, with no obvious shame, have accepted the offer and walked off the field. They refused. The refusal was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of 300 individual refusals. Each one was made by a man standing next to the man he had been pledged to since he had joined the unit. Each one was made under the gaze of the partner who would have witnessed the decision to live and would have lived with him afterward in the knowledge of it. Each man refused, each man stood, each man fought until he was killed, in formation, in the position he had been trained for 30 years to hold. When the killing was finished, the 300 lay in a roughly rectangular shape on the ground. The pairings were preserved in the placement of the bodies. Pairs of men lay together where they had fallen, the structure of the unit visible even after the unit itself had ceased to exist. The Macedonian soldiers walked among them, stripping the dead, taking the equipment, doing the work that follows any battle. The dead could be identified individually because the sacred band had been famous, and many of the men who picked through them had been told their names and their faces and the histories of their pairings. This was not anonymous slaughter. This was the destruction of a specific institution, recognizable by the way its members had died. The recognition was part of what made the event the kind of event it became in the Greek memory. Philip walked the field. The accounts of his behavior afterward are among the few moments in the ancient record where we get something resembling psychological access to the man. He had won. The Greek army was broken. The battle that he had been preparing for, in some sense, since 359, had been decided in his favor. The work of his career was, in the most important strategic sense, complete. He could have ridden off the field in triumph. He could have addressed the army. He could have done any of the things that conventional military victory called for. What he did instead was walk to where the sacred band lay. He stood among them for a long time. The sources do not specify how long. The Greek tradition that recorded the moment was written by men who were, in many cases, hostile to Philip. Athenian and Theban writers, men whose cities had been broken on this field, men who had no political reason to flatter the king who had broken them. And yet the tradition consistently reports that Philip, standing among the dead sacred band, was visibly affected. He wept, or he came close to weeping, or he stood for a long time in silence, looking at the bodies. And the silence was the silence of a man who was not entirely the man his enemies had taken him for. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, has Philip saying this: "Perish miserably they who think these men did anything ignoble or suffered anything ignoble." The exact phrasing is probably Plutarch's. The gist is probably accurate. Whether Philip used those words or different words, the sentiment was the sentiment of a man who, having killed 300 men who refused to surrender, was acknowledging in some interior place that the men he had killed had been his moral superiors. This is the Philip the conventional accounts of him tend to obscure. The Philip who built the bribery network, who broke treaties when convenient, who ate Greece city by city through 20 years of patient predation. This Philip was real, and it was the Philip who had won at Chaeronea. But there was another Philip in the same body. There was the Philip who had stood among the sacred band and recognized what he had destroyed. Then he moved on. There was a kingdom to organize. There was a settlement to negotiate. There was a Persian campaign to plan. There was the rest of the day, and the rest of the year, and the rest of his life. He left the sacred band where they lay. The Thebans buried them later, in a common grave, and erected over the grave a monument in the form of a stone lion. The monument still stands. The bodies of the 300 were excavated by archaeologists in the 19th century, lying in pairs, just as the ancient sources had described. Philip rode off the field. The work of the day was, in the operational sense, finished. The work of converting the day into a political settlement was the work of the next year. Philip turned to it with the same patient, methodical clarity that had characterized everything else. Chapter 9. The League of Corinth. The political settlement Philip imposed on Greece after Chaeronea was, by the standards of ancient conquerors, restrained. He did not garrison most of the cities. He did not impose tribute on them in the systematic way that the Persian Empire had imposed tribute on its subject peoples. He did not destroy the political institutions of the conquered states. He did not, with the exception of certain specific cities that had been particularly resistant, replace local governments with Macedonian appointees. The Greek city-states retained their assemblies, their courts, their laws, their religious institutions, their right to govern their internal affairs in the manner they had governed them before the war. This was not generosity, it was strategy. Philip had spent 20 years observing what humiliation produced in a conquered population. What he had observed was that humiliation produced unrest. Unrest produced the need for permanent occupation. Permanent occupation was operationally expensive in a way that more subtle forms of control were not. He did not want to occupy Greece. He wanted Greece to do what he told it to do. The two were different. The first required armies he did not want to spend. The second required only that he take from the Greek cities the one thing that actually mattered, their right to make foreign policy independently, while leaving them everything else. The instrument by which he did this was the League of Corinth. The League of Corinth was convened in 337 BC, the year after Chaeronea, in the city of Corinth on the isthmus that connects the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Philip summoned representatives from every Greek city-state to attend. Most of them came. The exceptions were Sparta, and a few small cities that had specific local reasons for staying away. Sparta had not fought at Chaeronea, having declined to join the alliance. Sparta declined now to join the League, on the grounds that Sparta did not join leagues. Philip chose not to press the point. Sparta in 337 was a regional curiosity rather than a strategic factor. The League's formal structure was the kind of structure a Greek would have recognized. It had a council, with seats apportioned among the member states. It had procedures. It had a charter. It had the general appearance of a federal Greek institution of the kind the Greeks had been experimenting with for 2 centuries. The Delian League had been formed in the 5th century. After it came the Peloponnesian, the Boeotian, the Second Athenian, the Aetolian, the Achaean. These leagues had structured Greek international relations across the period. In substance, the League was something different. It had one provision that distinguished it from every prior Greek federal structure. It granted Philip, and through Philip his successors, the position of hegemon. The hegemon led the League's military forces. The hegemon could call on the member states to provide troops for League operations. The hegemon could, in effect, make foreign policy on behalf of the entire Greek world, with the Greek world contractually bound to follow. This was the genius of the design. Philip had taken the federal Greek structure that the Greeks themselves had been developing, the structure that the Greek political tradition recognized as legitimate. He had inserted into it a clause that made him the head of it. The Greeks signed because the structure looked Greek. The structure was Greek. It was just a Greek structure that had, at its operational center, a Macedonian king. And the Macedonian king at its operational center could now do what no individual Greek state had ever been able to do, which was speak for Greece. The first thing Philip used the League for was the announcement of the Persian War. The Pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia was the cover story. It was not entirely a cover story. There was substance to it. The Greeks had genuine historical grievances against Persia. The Persian invasions of 490 and 480 BC, the burning of the Acropolis, the long 5th century proxy struggle in which Persian gold had funded the Spartan victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War. All of this was real history, real grievance. The Greek world contained a strain of public opinion that had been calling for a pan-Hellenic war of revenge against Persia for generations. Socrates, the Athenian rhetorician and political theorist, had been writing letters and speeches advocating exactly this for the better part of his life. The idea was not Philip's invention. It was a piece of pre-existing Greek political imagination that Philip recognized, picked up, and put to his own use. The use was specific. The Pan-Hellenic War gave Philip a story he could tell the Greeks about what the League was for. The League was not, on its public face, a Macedonian instrument for ruling Greece. It was a Greek instrument for liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule, for avenging the burning of the Acropolis, for completing the unfinished business of the Persian Wars. This was a story the Greeks could tell themselves about their own subjugation. The story made the subjugation easier to accept than it would have been without the story. The League was not, in this telling, the Macedonian conquest of Greece. It was the Greek mobilization for war against Persia, with a Macedonian king happening to lead it because he had the army and the resources, and by the convenient circumstances of recent history, the institutional position to do so. The Greeks knew this was partly a cover story. Most of them were not fools, but the cover story gave them a face-saving framework within which to accept the new reality. Most of them accepted it, because the alternative was the reality without the framework, which was harder to live with. The strategic planning for the Persian campaign began immediately. Philip had been thinking about Persia for 20 years. He had been preparing the army for it, building the engineering corps for it, assembling the logistical apparatus that would let an army operate at a distance for it. He had not been certain, at any given point along the way, that he would actually fight the Persian war. Circumstances might have prevented it. His life might have ended before the moment came. But he had been building toward the possibility, and now the possibility had become the certainty. The planning could proceed at full pace. The Persian Empire in 337 was a state in some difficulty. The king Artaxerxes III had been an effective ruler in his own brutal way, but he had been assassinated in 338 by a court eunuch named Bagoas. Bagoas had installed Artaxerxes' youngest son, Arses, as Artaxerxes IV. Arses had been ineffective. Bagoas had murdered him in 336 and installed a more distant relative of the royal family, Darius III. Darius proved to be a more substantial figure than Bagoas had expected, and he promptly had Bagoas killed. The succession struggle had weakened the Persian state at the precise moment when an external invasion would do the most damage. Philip's intelligence reports had been documenting the Persian instability in detail. He had intelligence reports. His agents in Asia Minor had been working for years. The timing of the campaign was being calibrated to the Persian weakness in a way that the Persian court did not yet realize was happening. The advance force was sent across the Hellespont in the spring of 336 BC. It was under the command of Parmenion, Philip's senior general, and Attalus, the uncle of Philip's most recent young wife. The force was substantial, 10,000 men. It established a bridgehead in northwestern Asia Minor. It made contact with the Greek cities of the region, several of which were already in revolt against Persian rule, and welcomed the Macedonian arrival as the liberation they had been waiting for. The bridgehead was secured. The path into Asia was open. Philip was preparing to follow the advance force with the main army. The plan was to cross the Hellespont in the late summer of 336, with the bulk of the Macedonian forces and the contingents the League of Corinth had supplied. He would begin the systematic conquest of the Persian Empire. He would have been 46 years old. He had been on the throne for 23 years. The conquest of Persia would have been the work of his 50s. The period of his life when his wisdom and his army and his political position were all at their peak together. He never crossed. Chapter 10. The Wedding at Aegae. The household at Pella in the last year of Philip's life was a household in some difficulty. The difficulty was the marriage to Cleopatra. Philip had married 7 times in the course of his career. The earlier marriages had been straightforward political instruments: Audata of Illyria, Phila of Elimiotis, Philina of Larissa, Olympias of Epirus, Nicepolis of Phaerae, Maida of Thrace. Each had cemented an alliance, neutralized an enemy, brought in a flow of intelligence about a neighboring state. Each had produced children. Each had been integrated, with varying degrees of friction, into the structure of the Macedonian royal household. It was a household built to accommodate multiple wives and multiple children, and the political functions they collectively served. The 7th marriage was different. The 7th marriage was to a Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra, the niece of one of Philip's senior generals, a man named Attalus. The marriage was made in 337 BC, the year after Chaeronea. It was made for reasons that were not quite political in the way the prior marriages had been political. Cleopatra was significantly younger than Philip. The match was, by the gossip of the Macedonian court, a love match, or at least an infatuation. It was a king in his mid-40s marrying a much younger woman because he had become attached to her. That was the kind of thing kings did, but it had specific consequences in a polygamous royal household with multiple existing wives and multiple existing heirs. The consequences came to a head at the wedding feast. The feast was held in Pella. Attalus, the bride's uncle, gave a toast. The toast was phrased in terms that suggested the children Cleopatra would bear to Philip would be the legitimate Macedonian heirs to the throne. The phrasing was either a careless error or a deliberate provocation. The historical sources lean toward the second interpretation. By implication, it delegitimized the existing children, in particular Alexander, who was the son of Olympias of Epirus and who had been understood throughout his 18 years as the heir presumptive. Alexander, who was at the feast, took the toast as an attack. He may have been right to. He responded by throwing a cup at Attalus and shouting some version of, "And what am I then, the son of a slave?" The shouting escalated. Philip, who was drunk by this point, drew his sword and lurched at his son, intending to discipline him. He was too drunk to manage it. He fell. Alexander, watching his father sprawl across the floor of the wedding feast, said something to the effect of, "Look, the man who's going to cross from Europe into Asia, and he cannot make it from one couch to another." This is the kind of family scene that in a dynasty can have larger consequences. It did. Alexander left Macedonia shortly after the feast. He went to Epirus, his mother's family, and remained there for some months. Olympias went with him. The Macedonian court was, for the first time in years, a court without the heir, without the heir's mother, without the political center around which the post-Philip future had been understood to be organizing itself. The succession, which had seemed settled for a decade, was now an open question. Philip resolved the question, partially through diplomacy. He recalled Alexander. He arranged a marriage between Cleopatra of Macedon, his daughter, not the new wife, and Alexander I of Epirus, the brother of Olympias. The marriage was meant to bind Epirus to Macedonia at a moment when Epirus had become, through Olympias's flight there, the alternative power base for Alexander. The marriage was, in a sense, a recommitment to the old alliance, a public statement that the Aegae dynasty and the Molossian dynasty of Epirus were still bound to each other, that the family quarrel had not become a strategic rupture. The wedding was the occasion at which Philip was killed. The wedding was held at Aegae, the old capital of Macedonia, the city that lay 40 miles south of Pella, and that was the traditional ceremonial center of the Aegae dynasty. The royal tombs were at Aegae. The kings of Macedonia were buried there. Important state ceremonies, coronations, royal weddings, the rare formal occasions that the dynasty made public, were conducted at Aegae rather than at the working capital of Pella. The choice of Aegae for Cleopatra's wedding was a choice loaded with dynastic symbolism. It was Philip's way of staging a public reaffirmation of the old order. It was a public reminder that the dynasty was secure, that the alliances were intact, that the family was, despite the recent unpleasantness, united. The ceremonies took place over several days. There were processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, theatrical performances, the entire apparatus of a Hellenistic royal celebration. The ambassadors of Greek states had been invited and had come. The senior Macedonian nobility were present in force. The army was represented. The court was represented. The wedding was, by design, the largest public event of Philip's reign. It was an event meant to demonstrate to all the assembled witnesses, Greek, Macedonian, Persian agents who had certainly attended, that the Macedonian state was at the height of its powers, and that the man at the center of it was secure in his position. On one of the days of the celebration, a procession was scheduled at the theatre of Aegae. Philip was to enter the theatre accompanied by the two Alexanders, Alexander of Epirus, the bridegroom, and Alexander of Macedon, the king's son. The procession was meant to display the unity of the two royal houses and the unity of the father and son. The procession was being staged with the deliberate visibility that royal ceremony required. Philip, at some point before entering the theatre, ordered his bodyguards to fall back. The exact sequence is not entirely preserved, but the substance is clear. He instructed his security detail to remain behind, to give him space, to let him enter the theatre visibly alone. He would be flanked only by the two princes, demonstrating to the assembled witnesses that the king of Macedonia could walk among his people without armed protection. It was the kind of gesture Philip made, sometimes, to project the confidence of secure rule. He had made it before. He had made it without consequence before. As he entered the theatre, a man stepped out from somewhere along the route. From a column, from behind a hanging, the precise position is not securely preserved, and he drove a knife into him. The killer was named Pausanias. He was one of Philip's own bodyguards. He was a young Macedonian noble of good family who had served in the Somatophylakis, the king's personal guard, the elite security detail, for some years. He was known to the king. The king would have called him by name. The killing was therefore not the act of a stranger or an outsider. It was the act of a man inside Philip's own security perimeter. A man with the trained access of a bodyguard and the motivation, whatever that motivation was, to convert the access into a strike. The motivation is one of the unresolved questions of the ancient sources. Some accounts attribute the killing to a personal grievance. Pausanias had fallen into a bitter quarrel with Attalus, the senior general and the uncle of Philip's most recent wife. The quarrel was a matter of injured honor. Attalus and the men around him had humiliated Pausanias publicly and gravely, in a way that the code of the Macedonian nobility could not let stand. By the standards of that court, it was the kind of insult that demanded redress. Pausanias appealed to Philip for justice. He had every right to expect it. He was a guardsman of good family, wronged by a powerful man, asking his king to right the wrong. Philip was in a difficult position. He had to choose between disciplining a senior general at the moment when he needed Attalus for the Persian campaign and providing the redress his bodyguard had asked for. He temporized. He gave Pausanias a promotion within the bodyguard. He offered him various forms of compensation. He refused to punish Attalus. Pausanias, on this account, had stewed for some years. He had come to the conclusion that the king's failure to deliver justice was a wound that could only be answered by killing the king. This is the story that the ancient sources offer most consistently. It has a kind of psychological coherence that the alternative theories do not quite match. It also leaves out, or does not fully explain, the operational details. The horses that were waiting near the scene, the apparent existence of a getaway plan, the suggestion in some accounts that Pausanias had collaborators, and the fact that he was killed almost immediately by other guards before he could be questioned, which had the convenient effect of making any larger conspiracy that might have existed permanently unprovable. The alternative theories accumulate around the missing pieces. Some of them implicate Olympias, on the grounds that Olympias had every reason to want Philip dead before he could remarry his way into a new line of succession that would displace her son. Some of them implicate Alexander himself, on the grounds that the 18-year-old prince had every reason to want a throne that he was now possibly going to lose. Some of them implicate Persian agents, on the grounds that Persia had every reason to want the king who was about to invade them dead before he could cross the Hellespont. Each theory has some evidentiary support. None of them is conclusive. The truth, as is so often the case with palace assassinations, is recoverable only as a probability distribution across several possibilities. The probability distribution does not collapse into a clean answer no matter how hard the historians try. What is certain is the immediate sequence. The knife went in. Philip fell. Pausanias ran. Other bodyguards recovering from the surprise gave chase. Pausanias reached the area where horses had been arranged for his escape. He nearly made it. He stumbled at the last moment. He caught his foot on a vine root, the sources say. Though the detail may be too convenient to be true, the pursuers caught him before he could mount. They killed him on the spot. He never spoke. The interrogation that might have answered the questions about who else was involved never happened. Philip, on the floor of the theatre, was 46 years old. He was the king who had taken a kingdom facing extinction and built it into the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean. He had broken Sparta's successor at Chaeronea. He had organized Greece into the League of Corinth. He had designed the invasion of the Persian Empire. He had sent the advance force across the Hellespont, and he was within weeks of crossing himself with the main army. The Persian campaign was the work he had been preparing for since his 20s. He had not lived to begin it. Whatever he understood as the knife went in, he understood alone. Chapter 11. The Inheritance. Alexander moved fast. This is the first thing to understand about the succession of 336. The 18-year-old prince had been on uncertain ground with his father for the past year. He had been excluded from the inner circle of the Persian campaign planning. He had been displaced in the new wife's pregnancy by a possible alternative heir. The prince did not hesitate. He did not deliberate. He did not consult. Within hours of his father's death, he was moving with the kind of operational decisiveness that marked everything he would later do. The decisiveness was the difference between his survival as king and his death as a discarded prince. The first moves were in the Macedonian court. He secured the support of Antipater, the most senior of the older Macedonian generals. Antipater was the man who had been Philip's regent during major campaigns, and who had the institutional weight to legitimize a succession. Antipater backed him. The army assembly, called by Antipater, acclaimed Alexander as king. The acclamation gave him the formal Macedonian legitimacy that the kingship required. By the end of the day after Philip's death, Alexander was king of Macedonia in the only sense that mattered. The army had recognized him. The second moves were against rivals. Attalus was in Asia with the advance force. He was dangerous because he was the father-in-law of Philip's most recent wife, and the natural patron of any alternative heir she might produce. Alexander sent agents to Asia with orders to kill him. The agents reached him. He was killed. There was an infant son who might have been a future claimant. Cleopatra had borne Philip a son in the months before his death, depending on which dating you accept. The boy was killed along with his mother, on Olympias's order rather than Alexander's, but with Alexander's tacit acceptance. The cousin Amyntas IV was the son of Perdiccas III. He was now in his 20s and had a technically valid claim to the throne by direct descent from his father. He was killed. Two members of the Lyncestian royal house, brothers who might have made claims of their own, were killed. By the time Alexander was 3 months into his reign, every potential rival in the immediate field had been removed. The mechanics of removal were brutal, and they were thorough. The thoroughness was the point. Philip had not done this kind of cleansing at the start of his own reign. He had let his nephew Amyntas IV live. He had absorbed him into the household. He had not preemptively eliminated the potential claimants. Philip had not needed to. Philip's authority, by the time he came to power, had been validated by the institutional work he had done. Alexander did not have that institutional credit. He was 18. He had won at Chaeronea, but Chaeronea had been his father's battle. He had no comparable record of his own. He had to manufacture, in the first months of his reign, the security that Philip had built across decades. The manufacturing happened through the elimination of every alternative. This was not a noble period. Alexander would do many noble things in the years that followed. The first 3 months of his reign were not among them. They were the months in which a young king, surrounded by enemies and uncertain of his support, did the brutal arithmetic of dynastic survival. He survived. The arithmetic worked. The Greek states, watching Macedonia from the south, made the predictable mistake. They saw an 18-year-old king, untested, surrounded by uncertainty, dealing with succession problems. They concluded that Macedonia was vulnerable. They concluded that the moment had come to throw off the League of Corinth and recover their independence. Thebes rose first. Athens prepared to follow. The Aetolian League made noises. The Peloponnese began to recalculate. Alexander moved south. He moved at speed. He moved with the army Philip had built, in the formations Philip had drilled, with the officers Philip had trained. And he hit Thebes before the other Greek states had finished deciding whether to support the rising. Thebes fell in a short, violent siege. Alexander made an example of it. He destroyed the city. He sold the surviving population, perhaps 30,000 people, into slavery. He left only the temple of the gods and the house of the poet Pindar standing. The destruction of Thebes was a calculated political act. It was designed to demonstrate to the Greek states what the cost of resistance would be. The Greek states drew the appropriate conclusion. Athens, which had been preparing to march, did not march. The Aetolian League quieted. The Peloponnese resettled into the League of Corinth. The Greek question, which it seemed to be opening, closed again, and it closed harder than it had been before, because the 18-year-old king had demonstrated that he was prepared to do, in cold blood and with operational efficiency, the kinds of things that even his father had been reluctant to do. This was Alexander, in the first year of his reign. Some of the older Macedonian officers had been dubious about him. They had wondered whether the boy would be hard enough to inherit Philip's position. They had been wrong. He was hard enough. He was, if anything, harder than his father had been. And the hardness had a quality of moral simplification to it that was not entirely Philip's. Philip would have negotiated with Thebes. Philip would have found a way to absorb the rebellion without destroying the city. Alexander did not negotiate. He destroyed. The destruction was the message. And the message was the start of a new style of Macedonian rule that the Greek world would spend the next 13 years learning to live with. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. The crossing was the act Philip had been preparing for. The army that crossed was Philip's army. The treasury that funded it was filled by Philip's mines. The political structure that kept the Greek rear stable while the army was abroad was Philip's League of Corinth. The strategic concept was Philip's concept, developed across 20 years of preparation, that Persia could be broken, that it was worth trying, that a Macedonian army could sustain operations at that distance. The senior officers were Philip's officers. Parmenion, Antipater, the men who would carry out the operational work of the campaign, all of them were Philip's choices, formed in Philip's service, trained to Philip's standards. Alexander executed, Philip designed. The distinction is essential and is often, in the popular tradition of the conquest, blurred. Alexander did not invent the army that won at the Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela. He inherited it. The genius of his command was real. It was the genius of execution at the highest level, the tactical decisions on individual battlefields, the strategic decisions about which directions to push and which to pause, the personal command presence that drove the army through hardships that lesser commanders would not have asked of their men. These are not small things. They are the things that made the conquest possible at the speed and scale it actually achieved. But the underlying instrument was Philip's. This is worth pausing on. because it is a point about which both the ancient tradition and the modern tradition tend to confuse themselves. There is a popular reading of the conquest in which Alexander, by some combination of personal genius and divine favor, accomplished a thing that no one else could have accomplished. This reading is wrong. The thing Alexander accomplished was a thing that a highly competent successor to Philip could have begun. Though it would not have been carried as far, it would not have reached India, it would not have been sustained for 13 years of continuous campaigning. But the conquest of the Persian heartland was within the operational capacity of the army Philip had built. The breaking of Darius III, the seizure of Persepolis, the establishment of a Macedonian regime over the territories of the Achaemenid Empire. It would have been undertaken in some form by whichever Macedonian king had been on the throne in the years after 336. What Alexander added was the velocity. He added the willingness to push past what any rational strategic plan would have specified. He added, eventually, the geographic ambition that took the army to Bactria and to Sogdiana and to the Punjab, far beyond what Philip's design had ever contemplated. The conquest in its full historical extent was Alexander's. The conquest in its initial form and its underlying possibility was Philip's. The two of them have to be held together. To credit only Alexander is to mistake execution for design. To credit only Philip is to mistake possibility for accomplishment. Both men were necessary. Both men did what only they could have done. The historical record has tended, for 2,000 years, to weight the credit toward the son, partly because the son's career was more spectacular, and partly because the son lived to be the king of the world he had conquered, while the father lived only to be the king of the kingdom he had built. The weighting is unfair. It is also, in the long memory, somewhat irreversible. There is a reason every educated person knows the name Alexander, and only specialists know the name Philip. The reason has more to do with what Alexander did with what he was given than with the relative magnitudes of what each of them contributed. There is a story preserved in the later sources of uncertain reliability, but with a kind of psychological truth that has kept it alive across the centuries. Alexander, in the last years of his life, in the long campaign through Bactria and India and the slow, exhausted return westward, was drinking heavily and talking with the old officers who had served with his father. The officers were getting old. Some of them had already died. The army that had crossed the Hellespont was no longer the army it had been. The veterans had been thinned. The recruits were Persian and Bactrian and Indian. The Macedonian corps was a fraction of what it had been at the start. Alexander was 32, or 31, or 30, depending on which year the conversation is supposed to have happened. He was tired. He had been campaigning for 13 years. He had lost his closest friend, Hephaestion, to fever. He had been wounded multiple times. The most recent wound, an arrow through the chest that should have killed him. He drank, in this period, more than he had drunk in his earlier years. The drinking was the drinking of a man who was working through something. In one of these conversations, the source being Plutarch, drawing on earlier traditions, Alexander said something to his men about his father. He said that Philip had found them wandering and poor, herding a few livestock on the hills, clothed in skins, and had made them lords of the world. Whether he said it in those words, or whether the wording is Plutarch's, he meant it. He meant it in a particular way. He was not, in this moment, claiming the credit for what he had built. He was acknowledging, with the specific clarity of a man working through what he had spent his life on, that what he had spent his life on was the completion of someone else's design. He had carried Philip's army to India. He had stood on the banks of the Hyphasis and looked east toward what he had not been able to reach. He had turned around. He had come back. He had survived the desert march through Gedrosia that killed half his men. He had reached Babylon. He was in the last months of his life, although he did not yet know it. and he was telling the men around him that the man he had been racing for 13 years had been dead the whole time, that the best thing he could ever do was complete what that man had begun. This was the burden. This was the specific weight of being the heir to Philip. The son who had to be greater than the father. The man who had to justify the inheritance. The king who had to become more than the king who had given him everything to become. Alexander never resolved it. He died trying. The resolution would have required him to outlive the comparison, to become a figure whose accomplishments could not be measured against Philip's design. The comparison was unwinnable, because Philip had already been the man who designed the conquest. There was nothing Alexander could do, however far he pushed, that would not still be a working out of the design. This is, perhaps, why he went so far. This is perhaps why he kept pushing past every strategic stopping point, into Bactria, into Sogdiana, across the Hindu Kush, into the Punjab. He was pushing past the comparison. He was trying to put enough distance between himself and his father that the comparison would no longer apply. He died in Babylon in 323 BC. He was 32. The empire he had conquered fell apart within 20 years. It was divided among his generals, fragmented into the Hellenistic kingdoms that would last for the next 3 centuries before being absorbed into Rome. The kingdom Philip had built, the Macedonian state itself, lasted longer. It was the institutional core that survived the fragmentation. It was the institution that kept producing kings until the Romans finally ended it at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. Philip's design outlasted Alexander's empire. The kingdom outlasted the conquest. This is a fact that the heroic tradition does not quite know what to do with. But it is a fact, and it says something important about the relative durabilities of design and execution. Alexander conquered the world. The conquest fell apart. Philip built a state. The state lasted 3 more centuries. The man who designs the institution is doing more durable work than the man who uses it. Most men do not see this, because the institution is invisible and the conquest is loud. Philip would have seen it. Philip had spent his entire life being the man who did the durable work that other people did not see. He would have, if he had lived to watch the conquest unfold, taken some private satisfaction in the way the Macedonian state survived the empire. He did not live to watch it. He had already designed it. The design was sufficient. Chapter 12. The Man. The body that lay on the floor of the theatre at Aegae in the summer of 336 BC was a body that had been recording its history and damage for 20 years. The right eye was a crater. The lid had collapsed inward into the socket where the eyeball had been before the arrow at Methone in 354. The flesh around the socket was discolored and pulled tight. It was the kind of scar tissue that forms when a wound has healed without being properly treated. He had refused to wear an eye patch. He had displayed the wound openly, the way he displayed the others. The display was a piece of his political identity by the end of his career. It was the king whose body was the proof of his presence on the battlefield, the king who had not led his armies from a tent. The collarbone on the right side was deformed. He had taken the wound in Thrace in 345 or 344. A Sarissa had glanced upward off his armor and broken the bone. The break had not been set perfectly. The bone had healed with a slight prominence, visible under the skin. The right shoulder sat slightly higher than the left because of it. He had favored the left arm in formal poses for the rest of his life. The right thigh had a long, ridged scar running from the hip almost to the knee. He had taken the wound in Illyria in 339 in a small engagement against the Trebellians. An enemy spear had penetrated his thigh and damaged the bone. He had nearly lost the leg. He had walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. The limping was more visible in cold weather. The gait was so distinctive that the Macedonian soldiers had taken to recognizing him at a distance by his walk. The limp had become, like the empty eye socket, part of his recognizable presence. There were lesser wounds. A cut across the forehead from an early skirmish, a puncture on the left forearm, a jagged scar along the right calf from a hunting accident. The body was, by 336, a record of a life that had been spent almost continuously in the field. This was unusual. Greek kings of the 4th century did not, in general, present themselves this way. The Persian kings did not present themselves this way. The visible damage of a working soldier was, for most rulers of the age, something to conceal, or to compensate for through the elaborate ceremonial display that distinguished the king from his soldiers. Philip had refused the distinction. He had eaten with his men, he had marched with his men, he had taken the wounds his men had taken. The political effect was real and it was deliberate. The Macedonian army knew it was being led by a man who shared their physical risks. The companion cavalry rode with a king who had bled with them. This is part of why the army was the army it was, and the king was the king he was. The bond between them was a bond that did not waver across 23 years of campaigning. He had drunk heavily. This is one of the consistent features of the sources, and it deserves a moment of clarity. It has been variously moralized into either a vice or a piece of barbarian color, when in fact it was something else. The Macedonian Symposium was a working institution. The king's drinking parties were not entertainment. They were the venue where political business was transacted, where alliances were formed, where the noble class was managed, where intelligence was extracted from foreign visitors. The king who could hold his wine through a long evening of symposia was a king who could conduct state business across an entire night. His guests grew progressively less guarded. His own clarity persisted. Philip had a famous capacity. He could drink quantities that would have disabled an Athenian, and he could come out the other end with the diplomatic outcome he had been working toward at the start of the evening still in hand. The wine was a tool. He used it as a tool. The fact that he also enjoyed it, that he was a man who liked his wine and his company and his songs and his women, did not obscure the fact that the symposium for him was a piece of operational equipment. He had married 7 times. The marriages, as I described in the earlier section, were almost all political. He had children by most of his wives. The household at Pella was, by the standards of any modern reckoning, complicated. There were sons and daughters by Olympias, by Audata, by Philina, by other wives. There were stepchildren absorbed from other households. There were the political tensions between the wives that any polygamous royal household generates, and there were the alliances and rivalries among the children that those tensions produced. Philip managed it. He managed it the way a competent CEO manages a difficult board. By understanding each constituency individually, by giving each enough to keep them functional, by tolerating the friction, because the alternative was a household that did not serve its political function. The wives liked him. Most of them did. This is one of the small facts about him that resists the conventional reading. Olympias would later quarrel with him bitterly, and she could have had some hand in his death. But she had been deeply attached to him in the early years of their marriage. The alliance had not been only political. Audata, the Illyrian princess he had married after killing her father's people, had borne him a daughter and had remained at the Macedonian court without apparent resentment. The other wives left fewer traces in the record, but the traces they did leave do not suggest the kind of pattern of mistreatment that often surrounds royal polygamy. Philip was a man who, despite the political function of his marriages, seems to have liked his wives, and who managed his household with the kind of personal warmth that made the political arrangements bearable for the women involved. He was a hunter. The Macedonian hunt was a piece of royal ceremony as old as the kingship itself. The king hunted on horseback with his nobles in the great forests of the Macedonian uplands, pursuing boar and deer and bear. The hunt was where young noblemen learned to ride and to use weapons and to function in coordinated groups. It was where political relationships were formed in a setting that was simultaneously dangerous and recreational. Philip hunted constantly. He hunted in his teens, and in his 20s, and in his 40s. He hunted with a recklessness that had killed lesser men. He kept hunting after he had been wounded badly enough that the hunting should have become impossible. He did not give up the activities of a younger man as he aged. He persisted with them. Some of this was political. A king who could not hunt with his nobles was a king who was failing in one of the basic dimensions of the kingship. But some of it was personal. He liked to hunt. It was a form of his life that he did not give up. What kind of man was this? The conventional readings tend to land on one of two answers. The first answer is that Philip was a calculating monster, the bribery king, the treaty breaker, the man who consumed Greece through 20 years of patient predation. The second answer is that Philip was a great man, the architect of the Macedonian state, the maker of the army that conquered Persia, the father whose son would not have been Alexander without him. Both answers are true. Neither answer is sufficient. The truer answer is that Philip was the kind of man who is rare in any age, but rarer still in the kind of position he occupied. He was a man who had absolute power in a culture that did not impose effective restraint on absolute power. He used the power, across 23 years, with a degree of strategic discipline that almost no one with comparable power has ever managed. He could have done what other Macedonian kings before him had done. He could have been a warlord, a feudal patron, a man who consumed the kingdom's resources for his own pleasure. He had, in personal terms, the appetites for that life. He liked wine, women, hunting, fighting, the basic rough pleasures of his class and his age. He had the cultural permission to spend the kingship on those pleasures. He did not. He converted the kingship into an instrument. He worked, through his entire reign, on a project that had a horizon longer than his own life. He built an army he would not live to see used to its full potential. He built a treasury he never spent down. He built a political structure in Greece that would outlast him by more than a century. He invested for 23 years in things that paid off after he was dead, and he did this without the cultural framework that has historically motivated other long-horizon builders, without the religious framework, without the ideological framework. He was not a Christian king with a notion of building for posterity. He was not a Confucian official with a notion of family duty across generations. He was a 4th century BC Macedonian noble, raised in a culture that did not have a developed concept of legacy in the modern sense, and he behaved as though he did. Most men, given absolute power, consume. Philip built. This is not the virtue the heroic tradition usually celebrates. The heroic tradition celebrates the warrior, the man who fights well, the man who dies courageously, the man whose individual excellence is on display in the moments of crisis. Philip had those virtues too. He fought from the front. He took his wounds. He died young by the standards of any normal life expectancy, and old by the standards of Macedonian kingship. But the heroic virtues were not the virtues that defined him. The defining virtue was the slower, less spectacular, less narratable virtue of long horizon construction. The man who is willing to spend 20 years on a project no one else can see, who takes the wound at Methone and keeps working, who waits for the right moment at Chaeronea instead of charging forward at the wrong one. There is no great speech in it. There is no shining battle. There is no romantic death. The work was happening in the army drilling that no one wrote down, in the bribery network that operated invisibly, in the diplomatic maneuvering the public never saw, in the long, slow accumulation of strategic position that was complete before the Greeks realized it had been started. This is the work most men cannot do. This is the work that, when it is done, produces the conditions in which the more visible heroes can operate. Alexander could go to India because Philip had built the army that could march to India, and the treasury that could pay it for 13 years, and the political structure that kept the rear stable while it marched. Alexander did the going. Philip did the building. The building was the harder work, and the building was the work that almost no one in the heroic tradition gives proper credit for. He stood briefly in the theatre at Aegae, surrounded by ambassadors and nobles, and the assembled witnesses of his summer of triumph. He had ordered his bodyguards back. He was making the gesture of confident rule, the gesture of the king who could walk among his people unprotected. He had made the gesture before. It had not, before, gone wrong. Pausania stepped out from somewhere along the route. The knife went in. We do not know what Philip understood in the moments after the strike. We do not know whether he had time to recognize Pausanias' face. We do not know whether he had time to think about his son, about Olympias, about the campaign across the Hellespont that would now happen without him, about any of the things a man might think about as he absorbed the realization that he was dying. The sources do not preserve any final words. The sources do not preserve any final gesture. The sources only preserve the fact of the strike, the fall, the chase that ended at the horses, the body of Pausanias killed by the bodyguards, and the larger fact that Philip II of Macedon, 46 years old, king for 23 years, was dead. Whatever he understood alone. The body was carried back into the palace. The funeral arrangements began. Alexander moved within hours to secure the throne, with the speed and decisiveness that would become the hallmark of his career. The Macedonian state, Philip's instrument, transferred to its next operator without missing a step. The Persian campaign, delayed by the assassination, would resume in 2 years. The army Philip had built would cross the Hellespont. The treasury Philip had filled would pay it. The league he had organized would hold the Greek rear. The conquest happened. The empire fell. The kingdom he had built outlasted both. He had been right about the durabilities. What remained at the end 3 centuries later, when the Romans finally absorbed the last Antigonid king, was the institution Philip had assembled in his 20s and refined in his 30s and perfected in his 40s. The institution was the man's monument. He did not need another. He had built the only one that mattered, and he had built it knowing, in the part of himself that built, that he would not be there to see what it could do. He stood among the dead sacred band on a hot afternoon in Boeotia in 338 and recognized something in them that he had spent his life choosing not to be. He stood in the theatre at Aegae in the summer of 336, and the knife found him. Whatever lay between the 2 moments was the work of his life. The work was sufficient. He had built, the thing he had built outlasted him. Most men cannot say so much.